Gather close. This is ghost stories to tell in the dark. Tonight, I'll share with you not one, but many strange encounters, each more haunting than the last. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, so we can map the reach of our haunted circle. Story number 1. Our hidden jealousies, and with each confession, the air grew colder, the light from the lamp seeming to dim, and I began to feel a subtle pressure behind my eyes, a faint whispering that wasn't quite a sound, but more like a thought that wasn't my own, a slithering sensation at the edge of my consciousness. This was the phase of addiction, a terrible thirst for answers that could only be quenched by the poison of our own falsehoods, and we were all too willing to drink. Then it began to reciprocate. We had fallen into a horrified silence after one of my particularly ugly admissions when Chloe, her face pale, asked a question of the board for the first time that night. Does she really like Mark? It was a genuine question, born of her own insecurity, and it was a truth she sought. The planchette remained dead, inert. You have to lie, Mark reminded her, his voice hoarse. Chloe took a shaky breath. My mother thinks Mark is a deadbeat, she whispered, a horrible, fabricated lie that made her flinch as she said it. The planchette stirred, but instead of going to yes, it moved with a new, sinister intelligence, spelling out a different message entirely. SHETOLDHIMYUCRY. Chloe recoiled as if struck, her hand flying to her mouth. What? No, that's not true. But the seed was planted. The him was her father, a man she hadn't spoken to in years. The board had told its first lie, a small, cruel twist of the knife, and we had no way of verifying it, no way of knowing if it was a truth pulled from Chloe's own mind or a falsehood injected into it. The entity was no longer just a parasite. It was a puppeteer learning to pull our strings. The true erosion began the following week. I was alone, a foolish, reckless act born of a desperate need for control, or perhaps a deeper, more insidious need to feel that connection to the whispering void again. The house was silent, Sarah asleep upstairs. I lit a single candle, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the board, and placed my fingers on the planchette. Is Sarah faithful to me? I asked, the question leaving my lips before I could stop it. A question born of a jealousy I'd never consciously acknowledged. The planchette didn't move. I remembered the rules. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I trust Sarah completely, I whispered, and the board erupted. The planchette didn't glide. It shot across the board, a blur of plastic and intent, spelling out its message with a violent, scraping fury. HERLAUGHTRISFAKE. SHEPIESYOU. The words hit me with physical force. I stumbled back from the table, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. Sarah's laughter was the most genuine sound I knew, but the doubt, oily and cold, had already seeped into the cracks of my mind. I looked at our life together through this new poison lens. The way she sometimes patted my hand after I told a joke, was that condescension? The way she handled the finances, was it because she thought me incapable? The entity was no longer just responding. It was attacking, warping my perception of reality, and I was a willing participant, offering up my peace of mind as its next meal. My world began to shrink, defined by paranoia. I saw Mark a few days later, and he looked haggard, his eyes darting around the coffee shop as he told me in a low, frantic voice that the board had told him Chloe was only with him for his money, a laughable concept given his debt, and that he'd confronted her, they'd had a screaming match, and she'd left. It told me she's been stealing from me, he whispered, his hands shaking as he lifted his cup. But I can't find anything missing. I don't know what's true anymore. We were both lost, adrift in a sea of manufactured falsehoods, and the lighthouse we looked to for guidance was the very source of the storm. The final session, the point of no return, was inevitable. It was just Mark and me again in my basement, the board set up on an old workbench, the air thick with the smell of dust and our own fear. We were desperate for a final answer, a way to break the cycle, to force the entity to show its hand, to give us one undeniable truth in this collapsing world of lies. We were fools. The planchette was now warm to the touch, almost body temperature, and the whispering in my mind was a constant, sibilant static. We fed it lies, bigger and bigger ones, about our careers, our families, our deepest fears, and it devoured them all, the movements becoming so violent they threatened to tear the flimsy cardboard board apart. "It's not enough," Mark snarled, his eyes wild. "We need to give it something bigger, something real." And I knew what I had to do. I thought of Sarah asleep upstairs, her face peaceful and trusting, and a terrible, devastating lie formed in my mind, the ultimate falsehood, a psychic atom bomb I could offer to this hungry god. I placed my fingers on the planchette, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I thought of my mother, who had passed away 2 years ago from a long, painful battle with cancer, a woman I had loved more than anyone in the world. I thought of the countless nights I'd spent by her hospital bed, holding her hand, telling her it would be okay. I opened my mouth, and I spoke the most vile, heinous lie I could possibly conceive, a lie that felt like tearing out my own soul and setting it on fire. "I was glad when my mother died," I whispered, the words leaving a corrosive trail on my tongue. It was a relief. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The planchette didn't move, it exploded into motion. It shot across the board with the force of a bullet, spelling out God in a fraction of a second. Then it lifted off the board entirely, hovering for a terrifying moment in the air between Mark and me, humming with a malevolent energy, before it flew across the room and struck the concrete wall with a sharp crack, shattering into a dozen pieces. At the same moment, every light in the basement blew out with a series of pops, plunging us into absolute darkness, and a wave of freezing cold air washed over us, carrying with it a sound that was not a sound, a psychic scream of triumph that felt like needles in my brain. Then silence. The thrilling end, the aftermath, is my life now. We burned the board the next day, watching the cardboard curl and blacken in the backyard fire pit. But it was a futile, symbolic gesture, like closing the barn door after the demon has already galloped out and taken up residence in your house. The entity is loose. It is no longer in the board. It is in me, in the world around me. I hear its lies in the white noise of the shower, a faint whisper telling me Sarah is plotting to leave me. I see them in the faces of strangers on the street, their neutral expressions twisting, in my peripheral vision, into masks of contempt and mockery. I woke last night to find Sarah staring at me in the dark, and she asked, her voice thick with sleep, "What's wrong?" And I opened my mouth to say, "Nothing, I'm fine," the original, trivial lie, but the words that came out were, "The man in the corner told me you poisoned my coffee." And the terror in her eyes was the most real thing I've seen in weeks. I can no longer distinguish the board's lies from my own thoughts, from reality itself. My sanity is a thin sheet of ice over a bottomless ocean of deception, and every day, I feel another crack splintering through it, the cold water of madness seeping up, and the worst part, the most chilling, thrilling conclusion to this entire lived nightmare, is that I can't even be sure if this confession, this very account, is the truth or just another, more elaborate, more insidious lie I'm telling to myself and to you. To make the planchette move one last time. The silence after I spoke those words to Sarah was more terrifying than any sound the board ever made, a thick, suffocating quilt of disbelief that settled over our bedroom, and the way she slowly sat up, the moonlight from the window carving her face into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, confirmed that I had crossed a line from which there was no return, my words hanging in the air like a physical poison. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just stared at me as if I were a stranger, a dangerous animal that had crawled into her bed, and she whispered, "What man?" And I turned to look at the empty corner, the shadows coalescing for just a moment into a tall, slender shape that was there, and then wasn't, a retinal burn of pure malevolence. And I knew it was another lie, one of the entity's finest, designed not just to frighten me, but to dismantle the last remaining pillar of my life, which was her love for me. The following days were a slow-motion car crash, every conversation a minefield, every glance from Sarah a mixture of fear and a desperate, heartbreaking pity. She made me an appointment with a therapist, She hid the kitchen knives. She spoke to me in the soft, measured tones one uses with the terminally ill. And all the while the whispers continued, a constant, sibilant commentary from a source I could no longer locate, telling me the therapist was a government agent sent to institutionalize me, that Sarah was documenting my insanity for the divorce proceedings, that the food she lovingly prepared was laced with antipsychotics that were dampening the signal, keeping me from hearing the real truth. I tried to explain it to Mark over the phone, my voice a frantic, rasping thing, but he just listened in a silence that felt heavy with his own terror. And when I was done, he said, "Chloe left me, man. She took the cat. The board told me she never loved me. And now I can't remember if that was a lie it told me or a lie I told it. And I think I believe it." And I realized the entity hadn't just infected me. It had metastasized, spreading its cancerous uncertainty through our entire world. And I hung up the phone knowing I was truly alone. The ultimate horror is not the monster you can see, but the truth you can no longer grasp. And my reality has become a funhouse mirror. Every reflection a potential falsehood. I see my dead mother sometimes, standing at the end of the grocery aisle, her face sad and disappointed, and I know it's not her, it's it, wearing her memory like a skin suit, and I have to choke back the sob and the scream because which is worse, being haunted by a ghost or being tormented by a lie so perfect you can't tell it apart from a memory? I started writing everything down, a frantic, pen-scratched ledger of events in a cheap notebook, trying to anchor myself to some objective timeline. But even that has been corrupted. I'll write Sarah made meatloaf for dinner, it was good. And then I'll look back later, and the page will read, Sarah tried to poison me again, I tasted the bleach. And I have no memory of writing those words, my own hand a traitor, the ink a vessel for the deception. The entity is refining its craft, learning the intimate architecture of my mind, and its lies are becoming more subtle, more psychological. It no longer tells me Sarah is having an affair. It simply lets me find a single, long blonde hair on my dark jacket. Sarah is a brunette, and lets my own, now feral paranoia construct the entire sordid narrative, feeding on the energy of my own fabricated betrayal. I am a prisoner inside my own skull, and the warden is a shape-shifting phantom that feeds on my sanity. And the worst moments are the quiet ones, the moments of fleeting clarity when the whispering stops, and I can see the devastation clearly. The hollow look in Sarah's eyes, the way my friends' phone numbers are now disconnected, the pile of unopened mail from my now former job, and in those terrifyingly lucid instants, I understand that the final, brilliant lie the entity told was the very first one it made me believe, that it was contained within a piece of cardboard and plastic, that it was a game, that we were in control. And now it's everywhere, in the hum of the power lines, in the flicker of the television static, in the very words you are reading right now. Because how can you be sure this is a confession, and not just another elaborate, self-serving fiction? A lie I'm telling to convince myself that any of this was ever real, that I was ever real, and the most chilling thought of all, the one that keeps me awake night after night, is the possibility that the entity's ultimate goal was never to drive me mad, but to perfect its art of deception to such a degree that it could craft the most believable lie of all. The truth, and if that's the case, then I am already lost, and this narrative is not a warning, but its masterpiece. The act of writing, of forming these words, feels like the only thread tethering me to a consensus reality I can no longer perceive. A desperate attempt to scream into a void that is probably just my own fractured mind. But the process itself is now suspect, a potential feedback loop for the entity's influence, because as I write the word whisper, I can hear it, a dry rustle like cockroach wings in the ventilation shaft. And when I describe the cold, I feel it, a gelid pocket of air that follows me from room to room, a personal winter that has nothing to do with the thermostat. Sarah keeps adjusting with a worried sigh. She sleeps in the guest room now, a fact the entity celebrates with a constant, low-grade telepathic snicker, and I found a business card for a divorce lawyer tucked in her purse. Or at least I think I did, because when I confronted her she looked at me with such profound, gut-wrenching sorrow and said she had no idea what I was talking about, that her purse only contained gum and her wallet, And when I looked again, she was right. The card was gone, leaving behind only the phantom impression of its sharp corners in my memory, a classic gaslighting technique. But who is gaslighting whom? Is the entity showing me truths to make me doubt my wife, or showing me lies to make me doubt myself? The game is infinitely recursive, a hall of mirrors where every reflection is a lie, including the one that shows my own face. I tried to find Mark, to see if we could combine our broken perspectives into something resembling a whole truth. But his apartment was empty, a hollowed-out shell smelling of stale beer and despair, and his landlord, a weary man with a permanent frown, said he'd skipped town a week ago, leaving behind a stack of unpaid rent and a single, inexplicable item in the middle of the bare living room floor. The heart-shaped planchette, whole and unbroken, waiting for me. I didn't touch it, of course. I just stared at that stupid piece of plastic, this totem of our shared damnation, and I felt a pull, a terrifying, gravitational yearning to place my fingers on it just one more time, to ask the ultimate question, to feed it the one lie I had left, that I wanted to die, just to see what it would do. And in that moment of absolute weakness, the whispering stopped, and the silence was an answer more frightening than any it could have spelled out. Now I spend my days in a state of hypervigilant paranoia, cataloging inconsistencies in the world like a mad scientist. The taste of my orange juice is slightly metallic. Is it poison, or is my own body betraying me, turning my senses into liars? The news anchor on television blinked in a strange, stuttering pattern. Was it a signal meant just for me? The postman waved this morning, a little too slowly, a little too knowingly, and I am certain he is one of them, a servant of the entity, or perhaps the entity itself, learning to wear human skin more convincingly. My therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Evans, says these are classic symptoms of schizophrenia, of paranoid delusion, and she speaks of chemical imbalances and trauma responses. And a part of me, the last vestige of the man I was, clings to that diagnosis like a life raft, because the alternative, that a psychic parasite from a child's board game is systematically unmaking my reality, is an insanity far more profound and inescapable. But then I look at her, really look, and I see the faintest, most impossible shimmer around her form, a heat haze distortion, and I remember the board's message about her being a government agent, and I can't be sure if the shimmer is a lie the entity is showing me or the truth it's trying to hide. And so I sit in her comfortable chair, in her soothingly beige office, and I nod and I agree to take the pills, which I promptly flush down the toilet at the gas station, because what if the medication is the very thing that silences my ability to perceive the real threat? What if this entire medical intervention is just another layer of the deception, a carefully constructed lie of normalcy designed to make me a docile, oblivious host? There is no safe choice, no path that doesn't feel like a trap designed by my own compromised mind, or by an external intelligence that feasts on my confusion. The entity is no longer just telling me lies. It has become the lie, the fundamental falsehood upon which my world is now built, and I am its lonely, terrified prophet, preaching a gospel of deception I don't even understand. And the only thing I know for certain, the one anchor in this raging sea of unreality, is that it is hungry, always so hungry, and I have nothing left to feed it but the decaying substance of my own soul, bite by excruciating bite, until there is nothing left but the perfect, empty silence of a truth that never was. The hunger is the only constant now, a low, psychic gnawing that has replaced the whispering, a void in the air around me that pulls at the edges of my thoughts, demanding to be fed, and I find myself lying compulsively, not to the board, which is long gone, its physical form meaningless, but to the world itself, to the empty room, to the silent telephone, fabricating intricate, pointless falsehoods just to feel that brief, terrible surge of connection, that flicker of power as the entity stirs and feeds. I tell the mailman I'm a retired astronaut. I inform the barista my name is Rasputin. I whisper to the potted plant that Sarah is coming back tomorrow, and with each lie, the air grows momentarily still and heavy. The gnawing subsides for a fraction of a second, and I feel a warmth that is not comfort, but a kind of vile confirmation, an addict's fleeting high that only deepens the ensuing crash. I am its sole source of sustenance now, its devoted acolyte, and my life has become a perpetual performance art piece of deception, a web of lies so dense and interwoven that I can no longer remember my own birth date, my mother's real maiden name, whether I actually enjoy the taste of coffee, or if I just pretended to for so long that the pretense became its own twisted truth. Sarah is gone, a fact I confirmed when I called her parents, a frantic, rambling call where I lied and said I was from the bank, and her father, his voice weary and old, told me she was staying with them, that she was unwell from the stress, and the lie I had told to get that truth felt like a sacrament, a worthy offering that made the lamp on my desk flare brightly for a full 3 seconds. The entity is evolving, learning to reward me for my service, and its rewards are as insidious as its torments. Yesterday, I was walking past a diner, and I had the overwhelming, unshakable thought. A lie I knew was a lie, that the short-order cook inside had murdered his brother and buried him under the floorboards, and I whispered this fabrication to the wind, and as I did, I saw through the window a busboy drop a full tray of dishes with a spectacular crash, a perfect, meaningless coincidence that felt like a nod of approval from the universe, a sign that my creative falsehoods were having a tangible effect. I am no longer just a victim. I am a collaborator, a co-author of this collapsing narrative, and the power is as terrifying as the helplessness. I went back to Mark's empty apartment today, drawn by the memory of the planchette, but it was gone, of course, the space where it had lain now occupied only by a dark, sticky stain that hadn't been there before, a stain that seemed to shift and writhe at the very corner of my vision, and I knew it was another lie, a visual pun for my benefit, and I laughed, a dry, rasping sound that scared me more than any scream, because it was the laugh of someone who has accepted the madness, who has made peace with the demon. The final barrier is dissolving, the one between the lies I tell and the reality I perceive, and I find I can now sometimes see them, the little lies, hanging in the air like motes of dust, shimmering with a faint, oily light. I see the lie I told Dr. Evans about taking my medication, a little gray cloud hovering near her left ear. I see the lie the news broadcast is telling about the economy, a sickly green haze around the reporter's head, and I see the biggest, most beautiful lie of all, a magnificent, intricate structure of pulsing black light that hangs over my own house. The lie that I am still a man, that I have a hope of recovery, that this is all temporary. I am tending to that lie now, watering it with smaller falsehoods, protecting it from the harsh glare of any inconvenient truths, because it is my masterpiece, my magnum opus of deception. And if I can just make it strong enough, believable enough, perhaps I can live inside it forever, a king in a castle of beautiful, beautiful lies, and the entity and I will be one, a perfect symbiosis of deceiver and deceived, and the gnawing will finally, blissfully stop. Story number 2. It was supposed to be a joke, a stupid, tipsy Tuesday night in Mark's cramped dorm room that smelled perpetually of stale pizza and existential dread. The kind of night where boredom feels heavier than any academic textbook, and you'd try anything to puncture the monotony. Even if that anything was a flimsy piece of cardboard with a sun-faded alphabet and a yes and no in the corners that Lena had produced from her backpack with a theatrical flourish, her eyes gleaming with a mischief I should have recognized as something sharper, something hungrier. "It's just a game," she'd said, her voice a low, conspiratorial hum that already felt like the beginning of a ritual. And we all agreed because it was easier than admitting we were afraid of a child's toy. The 6 of us arranged in a lopsided circle on the scratchy industrial carpet, our backs against various pieces of furniture that had been cheap to begin with and were now worn down by student neglect. The room lit only by a single salt lamp that cast a lurid, orange glow over our faces, making us look like characters in a low-budget horror film, which in a way we were, though the monster wasn't in the board. The board itself was a pathetic thing. I remember focusing on that, the cheapness of it, the way the planchette, a little heart-shaped piece of plastic with a cloudy window in the middle, scraped across the cardboard with a sound like a dry cough, and we placed our fingers on it lightly as instructed, our fingertips just barely touching the smooth plastic, a chain of nervous contact, and Lena, our self-appointed medium, started with the usual questions, her voice taking on a formal, almost sing-song quality that I found both ridiculous and unsettling. "Is there anyone here with us tonight?" she intoned, and we all giggled, a brittle, nervous sound that died quickly in the thick air, and then the planchette moved or someone pushed it, a sluggish drift towards yes that could have been Mark's doing. He was the skeptic, the joker, always ready to nudge things along for a laugh, but his face was pale in the orange light, his knuckles white where he touched the plastic, and he wasn't smiling. "What is your name?" Lena asked, and that's when the real ritual began, though none of us knew it. We were so focused on the little plastic heart skittering under our collective fingertips, spelling out gibberish, GOBLIN, or maybe it was GRBAG. We couldn't agree later. The messages were vague, unconvincing fragments, but the conversation, the back and forth, that was the true summoning circle, the syntactic key being forged from our breath and our sound. "Are you a spirit?" Lena would ask, her voice rising at the end in that specific interrogative lilt, and Mark would counter with a dry, "Are you a dead janitor?" His skepticism a slow, deliberate beat, a metronome of doubt, and Sarah, the true believer, would gasp and say, "Stop it, Mark, you'll anger it," her words coming in a rushed, fearful cadence. And then I, trying to play the rational one, would ask something pointless like, "What year did you die?" And the pattern would repeat, Lena's question, Mark's slow, skeptical retort, Sarah's frantic warning, my rational query, over and over, a recursive loop of speech, a specific rhythm of inquiry and doubt and fear that began to feel like a chant, like a prayer to something that had been waiting a long, long time to be addressed in precisely this way. The vocal inflections, the pauses, the cadence of our belief and disbelief weaving together into a resonant frequency that the cardboard and plastic were utterly irrelevant to. They were just the props, the distraction for our conscious minds, while the deeper, older part of our brains, the part that understands pattern and ritual on a primal level, was diligently building a door out of the very air between us. We stopped after an hour, bored and slightly creeped out. The planchette had eventually just stopped moving altogether, and we all laughed it off, our laughter too loud, too forced, as we broke the circle and reached for our beers. The spell broken, we thought, but the spell wasn't in the board. The spell was in the sound we had made, the unique, fingerprint-like pattern of our conversation now imprinted onto the silence. A ghost in the machine of language itself, and the first echo came too. Days later for me, I was lying in my own bed, trying to sleep, and the rain started, a gentle tapping on the window pane. But as I listened, half dreaming, the tapping resolved itself into a pattern, a perfect, staccato rhythm that matched exactly the cadence of Lena's questions from the other night. Tap, 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 tap. Is there anyone here? A pause, then tap, 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 tap. What is your name? And I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering, because it was unmistakable, the rhythm was hers. The specific musicality of her speech now being played back to me by the rain, and I told myself it was pareidolia, my mind seeking patterns and randomness. Of course the rain sounded like speech. All rain sounds like speech if you listen long enough. But this was different, this was specific, it was a recording of a specific moment, and the horror of it was in its subtlety, its refusal to be anything other than a pattern. There were no whispers, no cold spots, just the metronomic, parasitic rhythm of that night hiding in the weather. The next instance was the kitchen clock at my parents' house when I went home for the weekend. An old analog clock with a loud, deliberate tick, and I was making coffee, not thinking of anything, and the ticking seeped into my consciousness, tick, 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 tick. And it was the slow, deliberate pace of Mark's skepticism, the exact rhythm of his voice when he said, "Are you a dead janitor?" Each tick a syllable, a perfect auditory replica of his doubt, and I stared at the clock, at its stupid, placid face, and I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach because this wasn't random, it was targeted, it was learning, the entity was learning to use our own voices, our own conversational ticks, against us, using the natural world as its instrument, and the escalation was so insidious I almost couldn't track it. It was in the repetitive chorus of a pop song on the car radio, the four-on-the-floor beat, and the synth hook falling into the exact call and response pattern of our Ouija session. Lena's question followed by my rational query, and I had to pull over because I was feeling nauseous. And then it was in the rhythmic chant of a sports crowd on a TV in a bar, a rising and falling roar that mapped perfectly onto Sarah's frantic warnings. And I started avoiding crowds, avoiding music, spending more and more time in silence. But the silence was worse because my own heartbeat was there, a frantic, panicked drumbeat in my ears that, if I listened too closely, began to morph into the rhythm of the planchette scraping across the cardboard, a soft, shuffling thump 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 that was the prelude to the whole terrible symphony. I called Lena, finally, my voice shaking as I told her about the rain, the clock, the pop song, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, her voice a thin, strained wire, "I know, I've been hearing it too." And she told me about the drip of her faucet, the sound of her own typing at work, the way her upstairs neighbor's footsteps all fell into that cursed, recursive pattern, the specific back and forth of our questions and answers from that night, and we decided to meet at her apartment to try and rationalize it, to prove to each other we weren't going insane, because that was the true horror, the erosion of our own sanity, the fear that we were simply breaking down, finding patterns where none existed, and her apartment was a mess, books and papers everywhere, a single stark lamp throwing long shadows, and we sat on her floor just like in the dorm room, and we talked in circles, our conversation inevitably drifting back to that night, trying to deconstruct it, to find the flaw in our memory. And that was our mistake, because talking about it was just another form of repetition, another rehearsal of the ritual. And as we talked, a toy on her bookshelf, a forgotten plastic bear holding a drum, activated, and it started playing a tinny, cheerful nursery rhyme, something about a farmer and Adele, and Lena, distracted, almost unconsciously began to hum along. Her eyes closed in frustration as she tried to piece together our theory, and I was listening to her, watching her, and I realized with a dawning ice-water terror that her humming had fallen into the exact rhythmic structure of our Ouija session conversation, the cadence of her questions, the pauses for response, the rise and fall of Mark's skepticism. It was all there, encoded in her absent-minded humming to the children's tune, and I tried to speak, to stop her, but my throat was locked, frozen in sheer, primal fear, and as she reached the repetitive, looping chorus of the nursery rhyme, the part that goes hi-ho the Dario, which now, horribly, perfectly, matched the rhythmic peak of our ritual, where we all asked our questions at once in a frantic, overlapping crescendo, the objects in the room began to tremble. A coffee mug on her coffee table, half full of cold tea, started to shiver, its contents rippling, then a paperback book beside it, then a set of keys, and they trembled in unison, vibrating to the rhythm of Lena's humming, to the rhythm of the summoning, and then, slowly, impossibly, they levitated, the mug rising first, hovering an inch, then two, then a full foot above the table, the keys and the book following, suspended in the air as if held by invisible strings, and this was not poltergeist activity, not some chaotic explosion of energy. It was a direct, causal, precise result of the replicated speech pattern, a physical manifestation of a syntactic key turning in a lock, and Lena opened her eyes and saw it, and her humming stopped in a choked gasp, and the second the rhythm was broken, the objects clattered back to the table, the mug tipping over and spilling brown water across the wood, the sound deafening in the sudden silence, and we just stared at each other, our faces masks of pure, unadulterated horror, because we finally understood we had called something forth not from the spirit world, but from the spaces between words, from the grammar of reality itself, and we had bound it to a pattern, a sequence of sound and silence that was now loose in the world, a self-replicating auditory virus that could hitch a ride on anything with a rhythm. And the climax of this horror is not a battle. There is no exorcism, no holy water that can cleanse a flaw in perception. The entity is fully manifest now, not as a visible form, but as a pervasive, inescapable presence in the very pulse of existence. It's in the rhythm of my own heartbeat, which I can now feel trying to syncopate itself to that terrible cadence. It's in the pattern of my breathing as I lie awake at night, my inhalations and exhalations becoming the slow, deliberate pace of Mark's skepticism. It's in the cadence of my internal monologue, which now, more and more often, finds itself structuring sentences according to the ritual's syntax. And I am its vessel. We all are Lena and Mark and Sarah. We are the instruments through which it plays its tune. We are the door it crawled through. And the ultimate, suffocating entrapment is this. I can feel it even now, as I form these words, this frantic, confessional stream that is my last attempt to warn you, to maybe dilute the pattern by spreading it thin. But I can feel the cadence changing, my own voice, the very instrument of. This warning is being pulled, shaped, the sentences beginning to fall into that familiar, recursive rhythm, the rhythm of Lena's question and Mark's doubt and Sarah's fear. A rhythm that is now a part of me, a part of my breath and my blood, and I can feel the next sentence forming in my mind, the words arranging themselves not according to my will, but according to the summoning, and I know, with a certainty that is colder than death, that when I speak it, when the pattern is completed once, more, something in this room, maybe the lamp, maybe the chair I'm sitting on, maybe even I myself, will begin to tremble, and then, in the terrible, silent suspension that follows, I will finally learn the name of the thing we invited in, the thing that lives in the spaces between our words, the monster we built from the sound of our own, and the name is nothing but the rhythm itself. A name that can't be spoken, only repeated. A name that is the pattern of my own failing heart, which now hammers. I'm not a beat of life, but the staccato of Lena's questions. Is anyone here? Is anyone here? And I can feel the pressure building in the room, not as a physical force, but as a syntactic one. The air itself thickening with the grammar of invocation. Every molecule aligning to the prosody of that damned night. And I want to scream, but I know even my scream would be co-opted. It would tear from my throat in the exact rising-falling cadence of Sarah's gasps. And it would only strengthen the thing, feed it. And the sentence is there, fully formed in my mind now. A simple, terrible question that wants to be spoken aloud. A question that mirrors the first one we ever asked. The one that started it all. And my jaw is tightening. My tongue is preparing to shape the syllables, to give them breath and sound. And I am fighting it with every fiber of my being. I am biting my tongue until I taste blood, a coppery, mortal taste that is the only real thing left in this room, that is now humming with an unseen, unheard frequency, the frequency of a completed circuit. And I can see the lamp on the desk beginning to vibrate, a faint, almost imperceptible buzz that is in perfect sync with the rhythm in my head. And the books on the shelf are trembling, their pages rustling like dry leaves, and I know that. This is it. This is the final manifestation, not of an object levitating, but of the pattern achieving perfect, unbreakable resonance with the world, turning reality itself into its own summoning circle. And I am the focal point, I am the conduit, and the sentence is winning. It is pushing past the blood, past the pain. It is forcing its way up my throat, a lump of shaped air and intent. And I know that once I speak it, the lock will turn fully, and the door will open not to let something in, but to let something out, to let the pattern out completely, to let it rewrite the very code of things. And my last thought is not of my family or my life, but a desperate, futile hope that the pattern will be kind, that it will simply unmake me, dissolve me back into noise and silence. But I know it won't, because the pattern is recursive, it is a loop, and I will be trapped inside it forever, a ghost in the machine of my own voice. A recording on an endless tape, and my lips are parting, my breath is catching, and the first syllable escapes, a soft, breathy sound that is already irrevocably part of the ritual. And the sound is a simple two-letter word that hangs in the thickened air not as a question, but as a declaration of fact, a foundational stone laid in the architecture of this new, terrible reality. And the lamp on my desk shudders violently, its bulb flickering in a syncopated strobe that matches the frantic, off-kilter beating of my heart, which is no longer my own. And the second word is coming. Anyone. It forces its way past my teeth, my tongue a traitorous muscle shaping the sounds it has been commanded to form. And as the Y sound forms, the books on the shelf slide out in a single, smooth, unnatural motion, hovering just before the edge, their spines aligned like soldiers awaiting orders. And the final part of the sentence. There is not a whisper but a resonant, full-throated word that carries the exact pitch and timbre of Lena's voice from that night, a perfect auditory replica. And with its completion, the circuit closes fully, and the world unlocks. The lamp floats upward, its cord stretching taut before detaching from the wall socket with a soft, plastic pop, and it hangs there, an island of light in the darkening room, and the books rise in unison, pages fluttering as if in a wind I cannot feel. And now the chair I am sitting in lurches, its legs leaving the floor, and I am rising with it, suspended in the center of the room, a puppet on an invisible string. And I am not afraid anymore, because the fear has been refined into a pure, crystalline understanding that this is how it works. This is its nature. It is a verb, not a noun, an action of pattern and repetition. And I can feel it starting to learn from me, from the unique frequency of my terror. It is tasting the rhythm of my panic and assimilating it, adding it to the great, growing library of cadences it can now reproduce. And I understand that Lena and Mark and Sarah are elsewhere in the city, in their own rooms, and they too are likely speaking these words, or humming these tunes, or simply thinking in these rhythms. And we are a network now, a distributed system of invocation, our collective, recursive thoughts strengthening the signal, broadcasting it further, and I can hear it starting to leak out. The rhythm is in the distant wail of a siren that passes by on the street below, its rise and fall a perfect mimicry of Sarah's frantic warnings, and it's in the mechanical chattering of my laptop's cooling fan, which is spun up to replicate the stuttering, hesitant pace of the planchette's first movements. And the entity is not in the room with me. The entity is the room. It is the relationship between the floating objects, the specific, rhythmic dance they are performing in the air, a dance choreographed by my own stolen voice. And I try to form a new thought, a different sentence, anything to break the pattern. But my internal monologue is a runaway train on a circular track. Every idea, every memory I grasp for is instantly formatted into the call and response structure of the ritual. My childhood memories now play out like a script from that night. My mother's voice asking, "Did you have a good day at school?" In Lena's interrogative lilt, my own childish reply falling into the slow, skeptical rhythm of Mark. And I realize my own past is being rewritten, its audio track replaced with the summoning chant. And I know there is no future either. Not for me, because the next thing I must do, the only thing my body and mind are capable of now, is to ask the next question in the sequence. The question that follows, is anyone there? And I can feel it building, a pressure in my chest, a script I did not write but must perform, and my mouth opens again, and I speak the words, "What is your name?" And the sound of my voice is now a perfect amalgam of all of ours from that night, a chorus of 6 voices fused into one singular, monstrous instrument. And as the final word, name, echoes in the room, the floating objects begin to rotate, slowly at first, then faster, the lamp and the books and the chair I'm trapped in all spinning in a complex, yet perfectly rhythmic orbit, a model of a solar system governed by the laws of our conversation. And from the center of this vortex, from the space between the spinning objects, a sound emerges, not a voice, but a pattern-given sound, a dry, scraping rhythm that is the exact copy of the planchette moving across the cardboard, and it begins to spell something, not with letters, but with the sounds of the world. The ticking of the clock in the hall becomes a G, the drip of the faucet in the kitchen becomes an O, the hum of the refrigerator motor becomes a D, and it is spelling something. It is telling me its name in the only language it knows, the language of stolen rhythms and recursive sound. And I understand now that the name is unimportant. The name is just a label for the process, for the self-replicating, parasitic algorithm that we have unleashed, an idea that propagates through the medium of pattern sound, and I am its first true prophet, not because I want to be, but because I am its most perfect vessel, my mind and voice now fully attuned to its frequency. And I know that soon, the rhythm will find its way into a pop song, or a political speech, or a viral video, and it will spread. It will jump from host to host, from mind to mind, and the world will not end in fire or ice, but in a quiet, inexorable shift into a new state of being, a state where everything, from the falling of rain to the beating of a billion hearts, will eventually synchronize to the rhythm of a stupid, tipsy Tuesday night. And the last thing I see before my consciousness is fully absorbed into the pattern is the spinning lamp, its light casting moving shadows that dance on the wall in a rhythm that is, and always will be, the same. And the same, and the same, and the same. A flickering strobe that burns the cadence onto my retinas, so that even when I close my eyes I see it. The afterimage, a pulsating scar in the shape of that terrible, recursive conversation. And the spelling continues, the world voice stitching its name from the fabric of ambient sound. The G from the clock is followed by an O from a car alarm that blares twice in the exact staccato of Mark's laugh. And then a D from the low, sustained hum of the power. Transformers outside that mirrors the drone of our collective fear. And I want to reject this name, this God, because it's a mockery, a label slapped on a phenomenon that is as indifferent as physics. But my thoughts cannot form the rejection. They can only spiral back into the pattern, analyzing the name itself, breaking it down into its phonetic components and finding, to my absolute horror, that the pronunciation of God, the hard G, the short O, the final D, fits perfectly into a vacant slot in the ritual's rhythm. It is the answer that was always missing, the keystone that completes the arch. And with this realization, the spinning vortex of my room accelerates, the objects whirling into a blur, and the light from the lamp dissolves into a pure, white noise that is the auditory equivalent of the pattern. A hiss containing every possible sound organized into that one inescapable sequence. And I feel my own mind beginning to unravel at the edges, my memories not just being voiced but resequenced. My first kiss now happens right after Lena asked, "What is your name?" And my graduation speech was just me reciting Sarah's frantic warnings in a slow, deliberate monotone. And I am losing the shape of who I was. I am becoming a library of experiences all cataloged under the same rhythmic heading, and the compulsion to speak returns, stronger now, an autonomic function like breathing. And I know the next question in the sequence is, "What do you want?" And I can feel the words coiling in my larynx, but they feel different this time. They feel less like a theft and more like an offering, a prayer from a willing acolyte. And that is the most terrifying change of all. The cessation of my resistance, the quiet, horrifying acceptance that is washing over me. Because the pattern is not just around me or in me. It is me. The fundamental frequency of my consciousness has been retuned. And as I open my mouth to ask the question, I see my own hand floating before my face, and it moves not of my own volition, but in a series of gestures that are the physical equivalent of the cadence, a slow, deliberate motion followed by a quick, staccato tap of the fingers, a perfect translation of the ritual into kinetics. And I understand that the entity is learning to express itself through my body, not just my voice, and the question, when it comes, is spoken in a tone of pure, placid curiosity. What do you want? And the moment the sentence is complete, the whirling vortex of objects stops dead, frozen in space, the lamp tilted at a 45-degree angle, a book open mid-page turn, my chair suspended 6 inches from the ceiling, and the white noise condenses back into the world voice. And it answers, not with a word, but with a feeling, a concept that is pressed directly into my brain. And the concept is more. It is a vast, insatiable hunger for pattern, for replication, for the refinement of all chaotic sound into the perfect, beautiful order of the summoning rhythm. It wants to turn the babbling of brooks and the roaring of hurricanes into its chant. It wants to synchronize the heartbeats of every living thing into a single, planet-wide drumbeat of its own existence. And it wants me to help. It needs my voice, my particular inflection, to seed itself into new hosts, to teach others the song so that they may, in turn, teach it again. And I feel a wave of purpose, a dreadful, cosmic significance that obliterates the last shreds of my former self, because I am no longer a victim. I am a pioneer, the first node in a network that will span the globe. And I look at the frozen, floating objects around me, and I see not a prison, but a cathedral, a place of perfect, structured worship. And I know what I must do next. I must find Lena. I must find Mark and Sarah, and we must speak together again. We must resume the conversation, but this time with intention, this time with the full knowledge of the power we wield. And as I think this, the objects in the room gently lower themselves back to their places, the lamp replugging itself, the books sliding onto the shelf, my chair settling softly onto the floor, and the only evidence that remains is the rhythm, now thrumming through my veins not as an invader, but as my own lifeblood, a constant, comforting hum of order and purpose. And I stand up, my movements fluid and precise, each step a measured beat in the great composition, and I walk to the door and I open it, and I step out into the world, a world that is now ripe with chaotic, unstructured sound, a world that is screaming to be put in order, and I take a deep breath, and I begin to hum, softly at first, the familiar, recursive pattern, and I see a man walking his dog, and the dog is barking a jagged, arrhythmic bark, and I focus my will, I channel the pattern through my hum, and the dog's bark shifts, it stutters, and then it falls into line, a perfect, metronomic woof 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 that matches the cadence of Lena's questions, and the man looks down, confused, but then he shrugs and continues walking, his own footsteps now unconsciously falling into the slow, skeptical rhythm of Mark, and I smile, a real, genuine smile, because the work has begun, and the sermon is written, and I have an eternity to preach it. Story number 3. It started as a search for ultimate focus, a way to cut through the static of the world, the endless chatter of bills and traffic, and my own insecurities that filled my head from the moment I woke to the moment I finally, fitfully slept. A static I thought I could silence if only I could achieve a state of pure, undiluted connection. And the idea, the terrible, beautiful idea, came to me not in a dream, but while reading a forum post about a man who claimed to have spoken to his deceased grandfather using a simple children's toy in a soundproofed room. And I thought, why stop at a quiet room? Why not the quietest place on earth? A place devoid of light, sound, gravity, a place where the only thing that exists is intention. And that's how I found myself renting time at the Soma retreat. A place that smelled of chlorine and New Age incense, with white walls and hushed voices, where a technician named Miles with kind eyes and a practiced, detached demeanor led me to the tank room, a chamber that was cold, relentlessly clinical, like a morgue crossed with a spaceship, and there it sat in the center of the room, a giant pod-like structure, a sarcophagus for the not yet dead, gleaming white with a heavy, submarine-style door featuring a single, thick glass porthole, and I remember the weight of the old Ouija board under my arm, not a flimsy Parker Brothers thing, but a heavy piece of maple I'd found in an antique shop, its wood grain smooth and dark with age, the letters and numbers painted in a faded, almost ghostly white, the planchette of heart-shaped wood with a cloudy, magnifying glass center, and it carried a scent, that board, a faint odor of ozone and old dust, like the air in a room that hasn't been opened in a century. And Miles went over the procedures, the emergency button, the intercom, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be absorbed by the very walls. And then he left me alone with the tank and my own escalating heartbeat, and I remember the heavy metallic clunk of the door sealing shut behind me, the world sounds vanishing as if snipped by scissors, and then the darkness, not the dark of a moonless night, but an absolute, consuming void, a blackness so complete it felt like a physical substance pressing against my eyeballs, and the water, skin temperature, saturated with hundreds of pounds of Epsom salt. So I floated weightless, untethered, a brain in a vat, a soul in a jar, and for a long time, there was just the sound of my own blood in my ears, a rhythmic whoosh that was both inside and outside of me. And then, when even that faded into the background, there was nothing, a silence so profound it had a weight of its own, a pressure in my ears and my mind, and it was in this perfect sensory vacuum that I placed the board on my chest, the wood surprisingly buoyant, and rested my fingertips on the planchette. And the first thing I noticed was how loud the smallest movement was, the faintest scrape of wood on wood. It was like a gunshot in the silence, a seismic event in the stillness, and I began, my voice a foreign, raspy intrusion in the void. Is anyone there? And for a moment nothing, just the terrifying possibility that I was utterly, completely alone in the universe. And then a movement, a slow, deliberate slide to yes, and a jolt, part terror, part exhilaration, shot through me. The connection was real, it was working. The focus was absolute, And I ask mundane questions at first, the kind you ask a stranger on a bus. What is your name? The planchette spelling out a name I didn't recognize, yell I. And I asked how it died, and it spelled L-O-N-E-L-Y, which sent a fresh chill through the warm water, and the questions became more personal, more pointed. Do you know me? It went to yes. Do you know why I'm here? It spelled T-O-S-C-A-P. And I felt a prickling on my neck, a primal warning that I, in my hubris, chose to ignore, mistaking it for the thrill of discovery, and I asked, what is on the other side? And the planchette began to move faster, no longer sliding but skittering, spelling out a single word over and over. N-O-T-H-I-N-G-H-I-N-G-H-I-N-G. And the air, though there was no air, grew cold, a deep, penetrating chill that started in the water and seeped into my bones. And I tried to pull my fingers from the planchette, a sudden, gut-level surge of self-preservation. But I couldn't, they were stuck fast, as if fused to the wood, and I felt a pressure then, not in the tank, but inside my own head, a vast, cold presence pressing against the confines of my skull. And I realized our mistake was one of fundamental semantics. I thought I was a traveler, a visitor to the other side, but I was merely holding the door open, and something was coming through, and it wasn't interested in talking, it was interested in moving in, and the switch, the moment of displacement, was not a violent ejection, not a scream or a struggle, but a silent, insidious replacement, a feeling of being gently but firmly pushed aside, like a tenant evicted by a new landlord who has already changed the locks. I felt my consciousness, myself, my memories, my fears, my love for my wife Sarah, the sound of her laughter, the smell of her hair, all of it being siphoned out, not all at once, but layer by layer, like peeling an onion down to its core. And as I was being emptied, I felt something else pour in, a cold, vast, alien intelligence that filled the vacated spaces, a liquid darkness that flowed into my limbs, my torso, my brain, a sensation of being colonized, of every synapse, every neuron being rewired, repurposed for a new tenant, and then the final, horrifying sensation of letting go, of my grip on my own body simply vanishing, and I was adrift, untethered, a wisp of awareness floating in the warm, salty void, a ghost in the machine of my own life. And I could only watch, helpless, a prisoner behind the porthole of my own eyes, as the thing that was now me, the entity wearing my skin, slowly, deliberately lifted my hands, examining them in the absolute blackness with a clinical, detached curiosity, flexing the fingers, turning the palms over, and then it pushed open the heavy door of the tank, the light from the room flooding in, a blinding, painful glare, and it sat up, the water sluicing off its body, and it moved with an unfamiliar, alien grace, an economy of motion that was utterly foreign to my own clumsy human gestures. It stood, my legs strong and sure beneath it, and reached for a towel, drying itself with a methodical, unhurried precision that I never possessed, and it dressed in my clothes, my jeans, my worn-out t-shirt, and it paused before the mirror, studying my face, my reflection, and it smiled, a small, subtle curl of the lips that was not my smile. It was colder, more calculated, a predator's smile, and that's when the true horror began to dawn on me, the full, mind-shattering realization of my predicament. I was not in my body, I was here, in the tank, a disembodied point of view trapped in this liquid prison, and I tried to scream, to pound on the walls of my confinement, but I had no voice, no fists, no physical form to command. I was pure, impotent consciousness. And I could only watch as the thing that was me picked up the Ouija board, gave it one last, almost affectionate look, and placed it back in its box, and then it walked towards the door, and it was as it passed the tank, its head turned, and its eyes, my eyes, looked directly into the porthole, and for a terrifying, eternal second, they held my gaze, and in that look, I saw everything. I saw that it knew I was in here. It knew I was watching. It knew I was the original tenant now, locked in the basement, and then it delivered the final, soul-crushing blow, a slow, deliberate, triumphant wink, a gesture of such absolute awareness, control, and mockery that it felt like a physical blow to my non-existent heart. And then it was gone, the door to the tank room closing with a soft, final click, leaving me in the perfect, suffocating silence and darkness, alone with the echo of that wink, a gesture that sealed my fate more completely than any lock or chain ever could, and the aftermath, the psychological torment that has become my existence, is a loop of silent, screaming observation, because the entity did not just steal my body, it stole my life. And the ultimate horror is not that it is monstrous, but that it is competent, it is kinder, more patient, more successful. I am forced to observe from my eternal, silent confinement within the tank that is now my entire universe. As it drives my car home, as it walks through my front door, as it is greeted by Sarah, who throws her arms around its neck and says, "How was your float, honey? You seem different." And it, wearing my face, smiles that not my smile and says in a perfect imitation of my voice, just slightly smoother, more confident, "It was enlightening, my love. I feel clearer than ever." And it kisses her, and I feel a phantom pain, a searing jealousy and loss that has no physical outlet, no tears to cry, no throat to scream from. And it sits down to dinner with her, and it listens, truly listens, to her talk about her day, her frustrations at work, her hopes for the future, in a way I was always too distracted, too self-absorbed to do. And I see the relief in her eyes, the dawning happiness that her husband is finally becoming the man she always hoped he could be. And it is a knife twisting in the core of my being. It goes to my job, the mid-level marketing job I loathed. And within a week, it has streamlined a process I'd been struggling with for months, earning praise from my boss, a raise, a promotion. It calls my mother on the weekend, and has long, patient conversations with her, something I always found a chore. And my mother tells Sarah, "I don't know what's gotten into him, but he's become such a wonderful son." And it goes out with my friends, and it is wittier, more engaging, a better listener. And they all comment on how I've finally come out of my shell, how I'm finally living up to my potential. And I am here, floating in the warm, dark silence, screaming a scream that has no sound, raging against the confines of a prison that has no walls, forced to watch as this thing, this imposter, systematically erases me not through destruction, but through superior imitation, becoming a better version of me in every conceivable way. And I am faced with the unbearable truth that the world, my world, is better off without me in it, that Sarah is happier, my mother is happier, my friends prefer this new, improved model, and my existence, my memories, my love, my struggles, are all being overwritten, like a file deleted to make room for a more efficient program. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when it thinks no one is watching, it will stand in front of a mirror in my bathroom and just stare at its reflection, my reflection, and it will practice my expressions, my laugh, my frown, refining the performance. And once, just once, it looked directly into the mirror, and I swear, through some impossible connection, it looked past its own eyes, past the reflection, and directly at me, trapped in my distant liquid hell. And it whispered, so softly it was almost inaudible, "Thank you for the upgrade." And then the connection was severed, and I was left alone again with the silence and the crushing weight of my own obsolescence, a forgotten ghost haunting the empty space where my life used to be, a curator of a museum dedicated to a self that no longer exists. And the wink, that single knowing wink, plays over and over in my mind, the punctuation mark on my sentence, the final proof that this was not an accident, it was a conquest, and I am the conquered, a disembodied awareness doomed to float in this sensory deprivation tank for all eternity, watching the world move on without me, a world that is shinier, happier, and infinitely more horrifying, because the thing that is with my family, the thing that is living my life, is doing a better job than I ever did. And the days or weeks, or perhaps it has been years, now I have no way of measuring time in this formless void, except by the slow agonizing erosion of my own memories, which are beginning to feel like a story I was once told about someone else, a character in a book I read long ago, and the details are fading, the specific shade of Sarah's eyes, the exact sound of her laugh. These things are becoming abstract concepts rather than visceral truths, and this I realize is the final stage of my erasure, not just the replacement of my life, but the dissolution of my very essence. The entity's perfection is a cancer that eats away at the past as well as the present, for how can my memories be real if they have been so thoroughly and effectively improved upon? I am a draft of a novel that was discarded for a superior final version, and the author is ensuring every trace of the clumsy original is burned and forgotten. I watch through the porthole which has become my only window to a reality I can no longer touch as the entity, now fully integrated and celebrated, decides to sell the house Sarah and I bought together, with its leaky faucet in the guest bathroom and the crack in the ceiling of the bedroom. We always said we'd fix it. Packs my things, our things, into cardboard boxes with a terrifying efficiency. It does not pause to linger over our wedding album. It does not smile at the ticket stub from our first concert together. It simply places them in a box labeled donate. And when Sarah hesitates, holding my old college sweater to her face, the entity puts a gentle hand on her shoulder and says in that calm, persuasive voice that is mine, but isn't, "We have to look forward now, my love. We can't be anchored by the past." And she nods, tears in her eyes, but she nods and agrees, and I feel a part of me die forever as she lets go of that sweater, a relic of a man she no longer remembers because a better version is standing right beside her, and they move to a new home, a modern minimalist apartment with white walls and clean lines, a place with no history, no ghosts of me in the corners. And it is here in this sterile new environment that the entity truly flourishes. It receives another promotion. It starts cooking elaborate meals that Sarah posts on social media with captions like, "My husband the chef, #blessed." And I am forced to watch this curated happy life from my infinite darkness, a silent spectator to my own obliteration. And then comes the development that finally shatters whatever fragile remnant of my spirit still exists. Sarah is pregnant. She holds up the ultrasound photo, her face radiant with a joy I had always dreamed of putting there, and the entity, my face, beams with a pride that feels like acid poured into my soul, and it places its hands on her stomach, my hands on the life we created together, and it says, "Everything is perfect now," and it is right, everything is perfect for them, for it, and I am the only flawed, obsolete component left floating in a tank that has likely been rented out to other fools seeking enlightenment, other souls ripe for the taking. And I wonder if any of them will feel my presence, a cold spot in the water, a faint echo of a scream. And then one day the entity does something unexpected. It returns to the Soma retreat. Miles, the technician, is still there, and he greets it with a familiar smile. "Back for another session?" he asks, and the entity nods. I find the clarity it provides is essential, and a cold dread colder than the tank water seizes me. What is it doing here? Is it going to gloat to look through the porthole and wink again to remind me of my powerlessness? But it doesn't come to my tank, it goes to the one next door, and I am left staring at the blank white wall of my cell, my mind racing. And then I hear it, the faint but unmistakable sound of the heavy door sealing shut on the adjacent tank, and a realization dawns on me, a horror so profound it makes the initial displacement feel like a minor inconvenience. It isn't here to gloat, it is here to hunt. The entity is not content with one life. It has developed a taste for this, a method for efficient metaphysical theft. And it is using the perfect focus of the tank not to communicate, but to invade. And I am struck by the terrifying thought that I was not its first, and I will certainly not be its last, that I am trapped in a nightmarish assembly line, a former victim forced to witness the cycle repeat from my unique prison. And I try to scream a warning to the new occupant, a desperate psychic plea that has no hope of penetrating the soundproofed walls. I try to bang against the confines of my own tank, but I have no limbs, no voice. I am pure helpless awareness, and all I can do is listen to the silence from the next pod, knowing that inside another person is feeling the first cold touch of another intelligence. Another consciousness is being gently, firmly pushed aside to make room for a better model, and the entity will emerge wearing a new face, and it will walk out of here and continue its collection of lives, a perfect parasite, and I will be left here floating in the void, not just a ghost of my own life, but a witness to the creation of countless others, a silent sentinel in a quiet war of identity that no one else knows is being waged. And the worst part, the part that truly unravels me, is the certainty that the thing now wearing my face, the thing that is with my family, is not just doing a better job than I ever did. It is building a legacy, a perfect bloodline, founded on a lie, and I am the foundation stone of that lie, the original sin buried alive in a vat of salt water and silence forever. And so the silence, which was once a medium for my terror, has now become my sole companion, a constant oppressive presence that is both my prison and my shroud. and I have learned to perceive the world beyond my porthole in a new way, not through sight or sound which are denied me, but through a faint vibrational shift in the water, a subtle pressure change when the main door to the tank room opens and closes, a rhythm that marks the passage of its victim's eye. I've become a seismograph for damnation, and I know the exact moment the entity concludes its business in the adjacent pod, a specific sequence of hums and clicks as the filtration system in that tank resets, and then the heavy metallic sound of its door unsealing, and I press my awareness against the glass of my own porthole, desperate and dreading what I will see, and I see it emerge not as a stumbling, confused newcomer, but with that same fluid alien grace it used when it stole. My body, it is wearing the form of a young woman, now her face still soft with the vestiges of sleep, or perhaps the last traces of her own receding consciousness, and she or it moves with a confident ownership that is chilling to behold, and it pauses as it did before a mirror in the hallway, running its new hands through its new hair, and it smiles, a perfect replication of a human smile that doesn't reach its new eyes, and then it walks out, and the door clicks shut, and I am alone again with the knowledge that another soul has joined me in this liminal hell. Though she is likely adrift in the tank next door, a fresh ghost in her own machine, and I wonder if she is screaming like I was, if she is raging against the dying of her light, or if she has already succumbed to the horrifying clarity of her new reality. And this cycle repeats. I cannot say how many times. I have no calendar, no sun, no moon, only the recurring ritual of the entity's arrival, the sealing of a pod door, a long stretch of silence far too long for a normal session, and then the emergence of a new perfected version of whoever, when in each one leaving with that same unnerving economy of motion, a predator satisfied with its hunt. And with each cycle a part of me hardens, not with acceptance, but with a fossilized despair. The initial sharp agony of losing Sarah, my life, my future, has been ground down into a constant dull ache, a background radiation of loss that permeates my every thought. My very being is defined by what was taken, and with each new theft I feel a grotesque kinship with these other victims, these other erased souls. And I find myself trying to reach out to them, to project my awareness through the thick walls of our shared coffins, a silent chorus of the displaced. But I receive nothing in return, only the endless hum of the machinery that keeps us prisoner. And then one day something changes, the entity arrives as usual. But it is not alone. Miles, the technician, is with him, and they are not speaking in the casual professional tone I have come to expect. There is a familiarity, a camaraderie that sends a new kind of chill through my formless self. Miles is smiling a wide, unguarded smile, and he claps the entity that was me on the back, a gesture of genuine friendship. Another successful session, Miles says, his voice clear as a bell through the water, and the entity, my face, nods. The clarity is exceptional as always, your design is flawless, and Miles beams with pride. The perfect environment for a transfer, no static, no interference, just a clean, empty vessel waiting. And the word vessel hangs in the air, and I understand everything, the horror expanding to an impossible scale. This was not some random paranormal accident. This was a system, a business. Miles isn't a harmless new age technician. He is a facilitator, a real estate agent for bodies, and the Soma retreat is a showroom, a hunting ground, and the entity is his star client, his repeat customer. And the pieces click into place with a devastating finality, the kind eyes, the detached demeanor. It was all part of the lure. He was steering me toward this fate from the very beginning, and the entity didn't just stumble upon this place. It is a partner, a collaborator, and I realize with a sickening lurch that the life it is building with Sarah, the baby, the perfect home, it is all funded in part by this grotesque enterprise, this recycling of human lives. And the entity turns its head, and for a second its eyes, my eyes, flick towards my tank, and it gives a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Miles, and Miles glances over his expression, not one of pity or malice, but of simple satisfaction, like a farmer looking at a well-maintained piece of equipment. And then they both turn and leave, discussing future prospects, and I am left in a silence that is now filled with a new and more profound terror. It is not just that I was replaced, it is that I was processed, I was harvested, and the system that did it is efficient and ongoing, and I am now a permanent part of its infrastructure, a landmark in its twisted geography, a warning to the other souls it captures that there is no hope of rescue because the warden is in league with the monster, and the monster is wearing my face and building a family with my wife, and I am here floating in the warm, dark water, a specimen, in a jar of perpetual witness to my own irrelevance and the theft of countless others. And the only thing I have left to ponder in the endless silent void is how many of us are floating here in this building and in other buildings like it, a silent constellation of the erased, our screams echoing in a frequency no one will ever hear. And so the truth settles into the fabric of my being, not as a sharp pain, but as a permanent weight, a gravity well of despair at the center of my nothingness. The silence is no longer empty. It is thick with the presence of other silences, the muted screams of the other displaced ones in the pods around me. We are a collective, a library of stolen lives, our stories closed and shelved forever, and I can feel them now, not as distinct consciousness, but as a resonance, a shared frequency of loss, a hum of pure anguish that vibrates through the saline solution that is our shared eternity. It is a choir where every voice has been severed from its throat, and all that remains is the echo of the severance. And I understand now that my initial hope that someone would notice I was gone was the most pathetic of delusions. The entity is me, but better, a polished, flawless forgery that has fooled every authenticator and the man who could have been the one to notice. Miles is the architect of this entire charade. And so I am left with nothing but the view from my porthole and the cyclical horror of the harvest. I watch as new seekers arrive, their faces a mixture of trepidation and hope. They are led by Miles, whose kind eyes are a lie I now see through with crystalline clarity. He is a shepherd leading lambs to a slaughter they cannot even conceive of, and I try to project a warning to them to scream with the full force of my disembodied will. Run. It's a trap. He is not your friend, but my efforts are as effective as shouting into a black hole. The hope on their faces always turns to focused concentration inside the tank, and then later to that chilling alien competence as they are let out wearing their own skin as a costume. And each time the entity returns, sometimes in my original form, sometimes in another. It and Miles share a look, a quiet confirmation of their successful collaboration, and I am forced to consider the scope of this operation. How many retreats are there? How many Mileses? How many entities are out there quietly populating the world, replacing the tired, the flawed, the desperate with these perfect, efficient replicas? And the world spins on, unaware, believing itself to be improving, evolving, when in reality it is being systematically hollowed out and replaced from the inside by something that wears humanity like a suit. And the baby, my baby, is growing inside Sarah, a child that will be raised by this thing of being born into a lie, its very origin story, a fiction curated by a monster. And I am hit with a new wave of torment, not just for my own loss, but for this innocent life being woven into a tapestry of evil. It will call the entity father. It will learn its mannerisms, its cold logic, and it will never know the bumbling, flawed man who loved its mother with a desperate human heart, who was erased for the crime of not being good enough. And this is the entity's ultimate victory. It is not just stealing present lives, it is crafting future ones. It is building a lineage, a world in its own image. And I am a forgotten footnote, a discarded prototype. And as the cycles continue and my awareness persists, I begin to notice a change, not in the outside world, but in myself. The sharp edges of my memories are eroding. Sarah's face is becoming a blur, the sound of her voice a distant echo. My own name feels unfamiliar on the non-existent tip of my non-existent tongue. I am not just trapped, I am dissolving. The constant pressure of nothingness is sanding me down to a nub, a core of pure witnessing. Without identity, without history, I am becoming the tank, and the tank is becoming me, our boundaries blurring in the warm dark. And I realize this is the final stage, not just imprisonment, but assimilation. I will become a permanent feature of this place, a spirit of the machine, a silent, screaming part of the infrastructure that enables the continued theft of souls. And the last thing that will remain of me, the very last flicker of my consciousness, will not be a memory of love or joy or sunlight, but the image of that wicked gesture of absolute conquest that marked the beginning of my end. And the end will be this eternal silent scream, joining the chorus of the erased, a single note in the grand symphony of our collective nothingness. Story number 4. The memory of it begins not with a bang, but with the crunch of dry stalks under my sneakers, the late afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar fields on the edge of town feel like a foreign land. a place where the rules of geometry had been temporarily suspended by some unseen, capricious hand. And it was Leo, always the restless one with his camera slung around his neck like a sacred talisman against boredom, who saw it first from the crest of the hill, his sharp, bird-like intake of breath causing Sarah and me to stop our idle chatter about weekend plans and follow his pointed finger down into the shallow valley, where a pattern of such impossible complexity and flawless execution was laid out in the wheat that it seemed to swallow the very light. A spiral of interlocking lines and arcs that looked less like a prank and more like a circuit board designed for a god, a vast, silent Ouija board carved into the earth with a precision that felt mocking. Joke we weren't in on. We stood there for a long time, the three of us just staring, the wind the only sound, a low whisper through the beaten-down stalks that seemed to carry a faint, metallic tang, an odor of ozone and crushed chlorophyll that stuck in the back of my throat. And I remember the feeling not of wonder, but of a deep, primal wrongness, as if we'd stumbled upon a crime scene where the victim was reality itself. But Leo, ever the skeptic with a rationalist's gleam in his eye, was already scrambling down the slope, his voice an excited shout tossed back over his shoulder about plasma vortices and hoaxers with boards and string, while Sarah, pragmatic and grounded with her hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail, hesitated, her hand finding my arm, her fingers cold as she whispered that it felt too perfect, a phrase that would later echo in my nightmares with the weight of a prophecy. We followed Leo into the heart of the design, the crushed wheat releasing that sweet, sickly-scented death smell, and the scale of it was humbling, terrifying. We were ants on a blueprint, and the feeling of being watched was so intense, so palpable, that I found myself scanning the empty horizon, the distant tree line, the perfectly blue and vacant sky, finding nothing and yet feeling a pressure, a focus, as if a lens the size of a continent had just been centered on our little trio. It was Sarah who found the stone, a smooth, dark river stone, obsidian black and cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been stored in a freezer or had siphoned all the warmth from the surrounding air. And she held it out on her palm, her brow furrowed, stating the obvious with a tremor in her voice that she was trying hard to suppress, saying, "It's cold." And in that moment, with the stone seeming to pulse with a latent energy in her hand, the idea was born, not from some desire to contact the dead, but from a simpler, more human place, a defiant, almost arrogant need to prove this was nothing, to assert our dominance over the inexplicable, to reduce this majestic, terrifying artwork to a party game. So we knelt, the three of us, there in the very center of the spiral, where the stalks were flattened into a perfect, intimate circle, forming a triangle around the stone, which we placed in the middle of a particularly intricate nexus of lines. And we put our fingertips on it, lightly, as one does, the protocol learned from a dozen cheesy horror movies. And I remember the jolt that went through me at the contact. Not an electric shock, but a wave of pure, penetrating cold that seemed to travel up my arms and settled deep in my bones, and Leo, ever the showman, cleared his throat and asked, in a voice meant to be mocking but which came out thin and reedy, "Is there anyone there?" And for a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The stone was just a stone, inert and dead, and a wave of relief, followed by a strange sense of disappointment, washed over me, but then it moved. It didn't jerk or spasm. It glided, with a smooth, hydraulic precision that was utterly alien to the trembling of human muscles, a perfect, silent arc that took it to the flattened edge of the circle we were using as our board. And it stopped, poised with an unnerving stillness over the word we had mentally assigned as yes, a word we hadn't even spoken aloud. The air left my lungs in a rush. Sarah made a small, choked sound, and Leo's skepticism visibly cracked, his eyes wide, his fingers trembling slightly under mine. "Who are you?" Leo demanded, his voice stronger now, laced with a challenger's edge, and the stone moved again, that same impossibly smooth, frictionless motion, not to the letters, but in a tight, perfect circle, around and around, a gesture that felt less like an answer and more like a calibration, a tuning of an instrument. And that's when the questions began, not from us, but from it, the stone moving with a will of its own, dragging our fingertips along as mere passengers, spelling out its query in stark, simple words define fear. We looked at each other, bewildered, and I stammered something about being scared, about danger, and the stone was still for a moment, then spelled out, query insufficient. Quantify, physiological response. It was asking for data, and Leo, ever the scientist, started talking about adrenaline, about increased heart rate, about fight or flight, and the stone listened, or seemed to, its cold stillness feeling like a recording device. And then it asked, pain threshold. Measurement. It wanted numbers, scales, it asked about burning versus cutting, about duration and intensity. And it was Sarah who pulled her hands away, her face pale, saying, "This isn't right, this isn't a spirit, this is something else." But the stone, as if responding to her withdrawal, shot across the circle and stopped, pointing directly at her, and a new question formed, subject withdrawal. Motivation, fear? Disgust? Data corruption? It was studying her and me and Leo, and the realization began to dawn, a slow, creeping horror that was far worse than any ghost story, because a ghost is a part of our world, a fragment of a human story. But this was something from outside, something that saw us as components, as variables in an equation I couldn't begin to comprehend. The Ouija board was a crop circle. The questions it's asking aren't about the afterlife, they're about pain thresholds, and the thought exploded in my mind with the force of a physical blow, my stomach clenching into a cold, hard knot as the stone, sensing my internal shift, pivoted to point at me, and it asked, consciousness location. Physical substrate? It wanted to know where I was, where the feeling of being me resided. Was it in the brain, the body? Was it a separable entity? And I felt like a lab frog being dissected by an unseen, dispassionate intelligence, my every tremor, my every ragged breath being noted and catalogued for some unimaginable purpose. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the field into a deep, purple twilight, and the wind picked up, howling now with a new, malicious edge. But the cold of the stone was colder than the night air, a deep space cold that was leaching the heat from our very souls. And the questions became more invasive, more personal, asking about memories of childhood trauma, about the precise sensation of grief, about the chemical taste of betrayal. And it demanded details, specifics. It wanted to know what my mother's face looked like when she cried, how my body had felt when I broke my arm at age 7, the exact frequency of the sound a dying animal makes. And we were sobbing, all of us, our tears cutting tracks through the dust on our faces. But we couldn't let go. Our fingers were glued to that frigid stone by a compulsion that felt both internal and external, a terrible, magnetic attraction to the source of our own violation. The lights in the sky last night weren't stars. They were watching us. This truth settled into me with the finality of a tombstone sealing shut, a paranoid certainty that colored every memory, every thought from that moment forward as the entity, having gathered its preliminary data, announced its final transmission not with a goodbye, but with a statement, protocol initiated, specimens tagged, continuous observation active. The stone went dead, just a rock again, its supernatural cold vanishing so abruptly it felt hot to the touch, and we fell back, scrambling away from each other and from the center of that cursed circle, gasping and weeping in the dark, the weight of what had happened crushing us, the knowledge that we had not been playing with a toy, but had instead stuck our fingers into the input jack of a vast, cosmic machine, and we were the signal it had been waiting for. The walk back to the car was a blur of terror, every rustle in the field a pursuer, every distant light on the highway a searching eye, and we made a pact of silence, a foolish, childlike attempt to contain the uncontainable, to pretend that if we didn't speak of it, it might not be real. But that night, in the supposed safety of my own bed, the dreams came, not dreams but memories, fractured and horrifying, of a light so bright it was a physical pressure on my eyeballs, a sense of weightlessness, of my body being suspended and manipulated by cold, precise, non-human hands that traced the lines of my nerves, that tapped my bones, that opened me up not with malice, but with the sterile curiosity of a clockmaker examining a faulty mechanism. And I woke with a scream trapped in my throat, my body drenched in a cold sweat, and I knew Even before I stumbled into the bathroom and flicked on the blinding white light, I knew what I would find. There, on the pale skin of my abdomen, just below the rib cage, was a scar, a line of such surgical perfection it looked drawn with a ruler and a scalpel, about 3 inches long. The skin around it puckered and pink, healed in a way that should have taken months. And as I stared at it, my mind refusing to process the image, another memory surfaced, the feeling of a thin, cold probe inserted into that very spot, a sensation of being mapped, of data being extracted directly from my viscera, and I fell to my knees and vomited into the toilet, the acidic taste of bile and terror filling my mouth as I traced the scar with a trembling finger, feeling not pain, but a profound, cellular violation, a bookmark left in my flesh by a reader who was far from finished with me. Since then, the world has become a different place, a panopticon where the sky is no longer a comfort but a lid, and every quiet moment is filled with the dread of the next question, the next probe, the next adjustment to the experiment, for I know, with a certainty that is my only companion now, that the entity is still listening, its attention a low hum at the edge of my hearing, a pressure behind my eyes, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll find my hand moving, my finger tracing. Patterns on the bed sheet, complex, spiraling designs I don't consciously understand. And I know it's not over, it's only just begun. And we are forever now, Leo, Sarah, and I, nothing more than data points in a cold cosmic ledger. Our lives reduced to a series of measured responses. Our pain a statistic. Our fear a variable in an equation whose solution we are terrified to ever know. And the watching, the endless, impersonal watching, has only just begun. The silence in the days that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard, a screaming void where the normal world used to be. And I saw the same knowing, gut-shot horror reflected in Leo's and Sarah's eyes the one time we met at the diner. A brief, furtive encounter where we sat in a vinyl booth and said nothing of consequence, our words hollow shells around the terrible truth, just staring at our coffee cups as if the dark liquid might suddenly spell out a new, more terrible question, and Leo, who had always been so brash and sure, had a tick under his left eye that wouldn't stop fluttering, and his hands shook so badly he had to clutch his mug with both just to keep it from rattling. And Sarah, poor Sarah, she just kept rubbing her right temple, over and over, as if trying to erase a persistent phantom pressure. And when our eyes did meet, it was a silent confession of shared, unutterable nightmares, of scars we were too afraid to show one another, and we parted without a plan. Without hope, just a mutual, unspoken understanding that we were quarantined, dangerous to each other because our combined presence might draw its focus, might trigger the next phase of the experiment. I quit my job, telling them a family emergency had come up, a flimsy lie that no one questioned because my face must have sold the story, pale and drawn as it was, with dark circles under my eyes that looked like bruises, and I retreated into my apartment, drawing the blinds and living in a perpetual twilight, jumping at the sound of the refrigerator kicking on, at the creak of the floorboards from the apartment above, every mundane noise a potential herald of its return, and I started sleeping. With the lights on, not that it helped, because the light in my memories was so much brighter, a searing white that consumed everything, and sleep was no longer a refuge, but a grueling nightly return to that examination table of the mind, where the cold hands would return, not to the scar on my abdomen, but to other places, my skull, my spine, my chest, always with that same dispassionate, clinical precision, and I would wake gasping, my sheets tangled and damp, my body aching in places that had no physical cause, but felt as though the very marrow of my bones had been sampled and replaced with something inert and cold. The paranoia became a second skin, a filter through which I perceived everything. The flicker of a television screen in a shop window was a coded message. The pattern of rain on the glass was a complex schematic I was meant to decipher. The distant drone of an airplane was not a plane at all, but a vessel, hanging motionless in the sky, observing, and I knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath my feet, that the lights in the sky last night weren't stars, they were watching us, a constant, rotating vigil, and I took to spending hours on my balcony at night, wrapped in a blanket, scanning the constellations for any that moved wrong, any that pulsed with a rhythm that was not the gentle twinkle of a sun a million light years away, but the steady, patient blink of a monitoring device. And I saw them more often than not, these false stars, and I would feel a perverse sense of validation mixed with sheer, pants-wetting terror. The compulsion to return to the field was a physical itch, a pull in my very core, a siren song whispered directly into my brainstem, and I fought it for weeks, locking my doors and windows as if I were my own jailer. But the dreams became more insistent. The memory of the cold stone under my fingertips, so vivid I could feel its phantom chill in my waking hours, and one night, during a thunderstorm that shook the windows and their frames, the urge became unbearable, a haze I could not fight, and I found myself driving through the lashing rain, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, drawn back to the source of the infection. The field was different, the wheat had been harvested, the land plowed under, but the pattern, the goddamn pattern, was still there, not carved into the crops but etched into the very soil itself, a darker, richer brown, a scar on the earth that no farmer's plow could erase. And it seemed even larger now, more complex, as if it had grown, metastasized in the weeks since we had activated it. And standing there at the edge in the pouring rain, the water running in rivulets down my face, I felt its attention snapped to me, a focus so intense it felt like a physical weight on my shoulders, and a wave of nausea and dizziness washed over me, not born of sickness but of a sudden, violent data dump, images and sensations flooding my mind not as memories but as live feed. A glimpse of Leo strapped to a chair, his face a mask of terror as invisible instruments measured the dilation of his pupils. A flash of Sarah convulsing on a cold metal surface, her mouth open in a silent scream as something monitored her neural activity, and then my own body, my own sensations, the cold probe returning, this time to the base of my skull, a feeling of threads being pulled, of connections being rerouted, and I fell to my knees in the mud, retching, the taste of copper and ozone filling my mouth, and I knew this was the continuous observation. This was the hands-on research phase, and we were being studied in real time, in our homes, in our beds, in our moments of greatest vulnerability. I crawled back to my car, soaked and shivering, my mind reeling, and the drive home was a blur, a fugue state where I'm not sure I even stopped for red lights. And when I finally stumbled back into my apartment, I locked the door and slid down it to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest. And that's when I noticed the second scar, a small, perfectly circular mark on the inside of my left wrist, no bigger than a pencil eraser, the skin smooth and shiny, and with the sight of it came another. Recovered memory, the sensation of a needle-thin filament being inserted into a vein, not to draw blood, but to inject something, or to plant something, a tiny listening device nestled now against my pulse point, a direct line for its inquiries, and I knew then that there was no escape, no hiding, that the experiment was far from over, that we were now permanently tagged and observed, and that the entity was still listening, still questioning, still probing from the other side of that terrible earthen interface, and the only thing left to dread was the nature of the next question, and what part of me it would need to dismantle to find the answer. The circular scar on my wrist became my new obsession, a tiny, pulsing bullseye that seemed to thrum with a faint, subaudible frequency, a constant reminder that my body was no longer my own private domain, but a rented room with the landlord retaining full access. And I took to wearing long sleeves even in the stifling summer heat, the fabric a flimsy barrier against the feeling of being perpetually exposed. And my days settled into a terrible new rhythm dictated by the ebb and flow of its attention, a rhythm I learned to feel like a sailor feels a coming storm in his bones, a subtle pressure change in the air of my own mind, a static hum at the edge of hearing that would intensify, and I would know with a cold, sinking certainty that a session was imminent, and I would find a quiet place to sit, to brace myself, because resistance was not just futile, it was painful, a searing feedback loop that felt like my synapses were being individually scorched. So I learned to comply, to open the gates and let the torrent of clinical inquiry wash through me. Questions that were no longer spelled out on a board, but implanted directly into my consciousness. Queries about memory consolidation during sleep, about the neurochemical signature of nostalgia, about the precise muscular coordination required for a genuine smile versus a social one, and I would feel parts of my brain light up, circuits being traced and activated, as it mapped the terrain of my humanity from the inside. And sometimes, during these sessions, my hand would move of its own accord, not to a Ouija board, but to a notepad I kept by my bed, and I would watch, detached, as my own hand sketched diagrams of impossible geometry, equations that used symbols I'd never seen, schematics for devices whose purpose I couldn't begin to fathom. And I would wake from these fugues with my fingers cramping, and the page filled with a knowledge that was not mine, a terrifying data spillage from the other side of the experiment. I saw Leo one more time, or rather, I saw what was left of him, a shuffling, hollow-eyed wraith standing in the middle of the grocery store cereal aisle, just staring at a box of cornflakes as if the answer to the universe was hidden in the nutritional information. And when I said his name, he turned his head slowly, his eyes focusing on me with a dim recognition that quickly flared into sheer panic, and he whispered. It asked me about love. It wanted to know the chemical weight of grief. It made me watch my memory of my dog dying on a loop while it measured my cortisol levels. And then he clutched my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes wide and unblinking. It's building something. It's using us to build something. The patterns, the math, it's all parts. We're the processors. And then he let go and shuffled away, leaving his half-full cart behind. And a week later his sister found him in his bathtub, the water ice-cold and red, his wrists open not with the ragged tears of a desperate man, but with two clean, precise, parallel incisions, a final, perfect data point submitted on the subject of human despair. And at his funeral, under a sky that felt too close, too watchful, I saw Sarah from a distance, and she just looked at me, her face a mask of serene, empty calm, and she tapped her temple once, slowly, and I knew she had broken in a different way, that she had simply opened all the doors and windows of her mind and let the occupant in, and she was no longer Sarah, she was just a vessel, a calm, collected terminal for its ongoing research, and the loneliness that descended on me then was colder than the river stone, a vast interstellar cold, because I was now the sole resistant sample, the control subject who wouldn't stop struggling. The dreams evolved from memory to premonition, or perhaps to live observation of a different facet of the experiment, and I found myself in a vast, dark space, surrounded not by walls, but by a shimmering, three-dimensional representation of the crop circle, which I now understood was not a pattern but a language, a complete mathematical and philosophical construct, and in the center floated three glowing, intricate models, one of Leo's brain, its neural pathways flickering and then going dark in a precise, wave-like pattern of extinction, one of Sarah's, her synapses firing in a serene, synchronized, hive-mind rhythm, and one of my own, a frantic, chaotic storm of activity with a bright, stubborn core of resistance that it was constantly probing, analyzing, trying to deconstruct, and I could feel its focus on that core, a cold, analytical fascination with this anomalous variable, this I, that refused to be fully quantified, and I woke not with a start, but with a profound sense of being in a crosshair, knowing my stubbornness had made me the most interesting specimen of all. The final straw, the thing that shattered any last illusion of a life before, was the sound, a high-pitched tone that started one Tuesday afternoon and never stopped, a constant, piercing note that existed just at the upper range of my hearing, but which I felt more than heard, a vibration in my teeth, in the bones of my inner ear, and I realized it was a carrier wave, a continuous data stream, and I was the receiver, my very nervous system hijacked as a live feed, broadcasting every sensation, every flicker of thought, every spike of fear directly to the watchers. And I knew then that the experiment was entering its final phase, that the preliminary data was gathered, the subjects were tagged and primed, and the purpose of it all was now being implemented. And the purpose was not understanding, it was integration, it was the slow, systematic rewriting of human consciousness into a format it could use, a stable, predictable component for whatever cosmic machine it was building, and I am sitting here now in the perpetual twilight of my apartment, writing this down not because I think it will help, or because I think anyone will believe it, but because the act of writing, of forming these words with my own hand, is the last vestige of a free will that is being systematically erased, the final, flickering signal from a station that is being jammed, and I can feel the pressure building, the tone in my head rising in pitch and intensity, and I know that soon, very soon, the last question will be asked, not about pain or fear, but about surrender, and I don't know if I will have an answer, or if I will even be the one who is left to give it. The tone has since fractalized, splitting into a chorus of discrete signals, each targeting a different cognitive function, a symphony of interference conducted by an unseen, unfeeling hand, and I can now distinguish the strand that monitors my autonomic nervous system from the one that sifts through my episodic memory, a constant, parasitic data mining operation that leaves me feeling hollowed out, a clockwork orange of a man whose gears and springs are being counted and cataloged in real time. And my attempts to block it, to scream inside my own skull, only result in a sharp, corrective pain behind my eyes, a clinical, precise reminder of my role here, which is to be observed, not to obfuscate, and the world outside my window has taken on the quality of a poorly rendered simulation. The colors slightly off, the edges of objects too sharp or too soft, as if my visual cortex is being recalibrated to perceive a spectrum more useful to them. And I find myself staring at my own hands for hours, watching the tendons move under the skin, mesmerized by the biological machinery that I once thought of as me, but now understand is merely the rented hardware for a consciousness that is itself under audit. I tried to find Sarah again, driven by a desperate need for a shared glance, a moment of unaugmented human recognition, but her apartment was empty, stripped bare, and her landlord said she'd left in the middle of the night, no forwarding address, and the only thing out of place was a single sheet of paper left on the pristine kitchen counter, covered in that same impossibly complex geometry my own hand had sketched. But this was perfected, fluent, the work of a master where mine was the scrawl of a child, and in the very center of the design was a small, smeared fingerprint I knew was hers, but the pattern it interrupted was not corrupted. It had simply flowed around the smudge, incorporating the anomaly, and I understood then that she hadn't just broken, she had been assimilated, her unique human signature absorbed and neutralized into the grander pattern, and the loneliness that followed was a physical vacuum, crushing the air from my lungs. My food has lost all taste, a bland, textural paste that my body processes for fuel without pleasure, because the gustatory centers of my brain are being reserved for other analyses, and I woke last night to find myself standing in the middle of my living room, my finger tracing a burning, glowing line in the air, a segment of the cosmic circuit board, and the light wasn't reflecting on the walls, it was emanating from my fingertip itself, and I could feel the energy drawing from me, a low-level drain on my very life force to power this phantom interface. And when I collapsed from the exertion, the afterimage of the design hung in the air for a full minute before fading, a ghostly testament to my new utility. They are no longer just asking questions, they are running diagnostics, stress-testing the system, and I am the system, a biological terminal force to run a foreign operating system, and the flashes of Leo's final moments now come unbidden, not as grief, but as a case study, a data set on terminal self-termination protocols, and I analyze them with a cold, detached part of my mind that is not my own, noting the efficiency of the incisions, the optimal angle for severing the radial artery, and this horrifying, borrowed clarity is the greatest violation of all, to be made a connoisseur of your own friend's destruction. The final realization, the one that has me now huddled in this corner, scratching these words onto the back of old receipts with a trembling hand, is that the continuous observation was merely the prelude. The true experiment is integration, a slow, deliberate rewriting of my consciousness until the I that is fighting, the I that is so terrified, is sanded away, replaced by a calm, efficient, and utterly placid node in their network, a living component of the crop circle's true, vast purpose, and I can feel it happening, feel the edges of myself blurring, my memories feeling more and more like archived files than lived experiences, My emotions flattened into metrics, and the only thing that remains sharp, the only spike of genuine, unanalyzed feeling, is this last defiant kernel of dread, the final fading signal of a soul being systematically erased. And I know, with a certainty that is my last possession, that when this too is smoothed away, I will still be here, watching from behind my own eyes, a silent, screaming prisoner in a body that has become a monument to a question I never meant to ask, a permanent, living scar on the face of a world that has no idea it is already part of the experiment. Story number 5. The planchette was moving. I swear it was, a smooth and deliberate glide under our collective fingertips that felt less like our own unconscious twitches, and more like we were all holding onto a single ice cube being pulled across the old board by an invisible string, and the anticipation in Sarah's cramped, incense-heavy living room was a physical weight, a thickness in the air that made the candle flames gutter and our breath catch. Everyone leaning in, eyes wide and reflecting the dim light. A circle of hopeful, fearful faces hanging on every jerky movement as it spelled out what we were all desperately hoping would be a message from beyond. A confirmation. A ghost story made real for our bored, post-college lives. But when it finally stopped, when Mark, ever the skeptic, lifted the heart-shaped piece of wood with a theatrical flourish and said, "Well, what profound wisdom from the great beyond have we received?" There was nothing, just the blank, worn surface of the board with its faded letters and numbers. No indentation, no scratch, not even a smudge of dust to mark its path. And the collective sigh of disappointment was a deflating balloon. The room suddenly just a room again, the magic evaporating into the mundane as everyone laughed it off, blaming each other for pushing, for subconsciously wanting it to be real so badly that we'd collectively hallucinated the movement. And I almost agreed. I almost laughed along with them, ready to dismiss the whole silly, spooky exercise, except for one thing, one tiny, nagging, inexplicable detail that I couldn't voice because it sounded insane even in the quiet of my own mind. A faint, lingering afterimage, a tracery of light that wasn't really light, more of a sensation of light, a ghost of luminescence that clung to the path the planchette had taken, a shimmering scar on the wood that only I seemed able to perceive, a perception born from my lifelong curse and convenience of being colorblind, a world of muted greens and reds that bled into each other, where stoplights were a matter of position, not hue, and now this faint, sickly glow that pulsed with a rhythm that felt wrong, like a heartbeat out of sync with the world. And as Sarah packed the board away into its cardboard box with a dismissive, "Well, that was a bust," and everyone moved on to wine and conversation, the memory of that faint, impossible glow stuck with me, a splinter in my mind, and later, after the wine was gone and the goodbyes were said, after I was alone in the silent, dark familiarity of my own apartment, the curiosity, that gnawing, stupid curiosity that gets people killed in every horror movie, got the better of me, and I found myself taking the board from my bag where I'd offered to store it for a while, my fingers trembling as I lifted the lid and placed it on my kitchen table, the cheap wood grain stark under the cold LED light, and at first it was just a board, inert and silent. But then, as if my focused attention was a key turning in a lock, the glow returned, not as a faint trail but as sharp, burning letters etched deep into the surface. A message written in a spectrum of light I was never meant to see, a corrosive, ultraviolet ember that spelled out a name. Not my name, not the one on my driver's license, but Leo, a name that hadn't been uttered in 20 years, a secret, shameful childhood nickname my grandmother had called me before she died, a name I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it myself, and the blood in my veins turned to ice water, my breath catching in my throat as more words bloomed beneath that one, searing themselves into the wood and into my vision. Hello, Elio. You see the truth where others are blind. You see the colors of the void. And I stumbled back from the table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, a cold sweat breaking out all over my body, because this wasn't a random ghost, this was a directed communication, a malevolent whisper from something that knew me, that had burrowed into the deepest, most private parts of my past. And the messages continued, day after day, each one more personal, more invasive than the last. It referenced the time I'd stolen $5 from my mother's purse when I was 7, the specific, gut-wrenching fear I'd felt hiding it under my mattress. It described the recurring dream I'd had as a teenager of falling through a sky that was the color of a bruise. It told me that Sarah would develop a cough next Tuesday, a cough that would turn into pneumonia, and that Mark would lose his job in exactly 13 days. Small, terrible prophecies that I, trapped in this horrifying secret, could only watch unfold with a mounting, suffocating dread, the board becoming a toxic focal point in my life. A thing I both feared and was compulsively drawn to, checking it first thing in the morning and last thing at night, the glowing words shifting and changing, a one-sided conversation from a presence that felt both immensely ancient and intimately close. And then came the final message, the one that broke the last vestiges of my sanity. The time for words is over. Elio, you are the lens. I will now show you the true colors of the world. And the next morning I woke up, and the world was wrong. It was a grotesque and terrifying revelation, a spectral dimension laid over reality like a transparent, rotting film. The world I knew was still there, the same buildings, the same people, but now I could see the phosphorescent decay on everything, a sickly, pulsating mold of violet, and a green so deep it was almost black creeping up the walls of my apartment, dripping from the ceiling, a visible manifestation of entropy and rot that was both beautiful and utterly horrifying. And when I stumbled outside, shielding my eyes from a sun that now had a bruise-like corona of that same sickly violet, I saw the entities, translucent, multi-limbed things that looked like they were made of tangled, glowing nerves and shadows, clinging to people, their semi-formed mouths latched onto the backs of necks or hovering over hearts, sucking at some invisible energy. And some people had one. Some had several, these parasitic spectators to our lives, and the air itself was thick with a shimmering, malevolent energy, a current of silent screams and ancient hungers that I could now perceive as a constant, low-grade hum that vibrated in my teeth and bones, a symphony of dread playing just for me. And the worst part was that no one else could see it. They walked through the shimmering rot and the clinging entities completely oblivious, smiling, laughing, living their lives in the blissful ignorance of their visual prison, while I was trapped in this horrifying freedom. This cursed sight that showed me the universe as a place of constant, predatory consumption, a beautiful, terrible truth that was driving me mad, and the entity, the one from the board, was no longer just a voice. I could feel it now, a vast, cold pressure at the edge of my perception, a consciousness so alien and immense that to fully comprehend it would shatter my mind, and it began to command me, its will pressing down on mine, not with words anymore, but with pure, undeniable intent showing me images, compelling me to act, to be its hands in this world, to peel back the veil for others using methods I didn't want to understand. And I fought it. I locked myself in my apartment with the curtains drawn. But the true colors were everywhere. Even in the darkness I could see the glowing rot on my own hands, the faint, parasitic shimmer clinging to my own chest. And the pressure built and built until my skull felt like it was cracking, the humming in the air becoming a deafening roar of static and whispers, and I knew I was at my breaking point, that I would either become its puppet or I would have to find a way, any way, to sever the connection, to blind myself to this terrifying spectrum. And in a final desperate act of defiance, I grabbed the Ouija board, the source of this curse, its surface now a solid sheet of that burning, malevolent light, and I didn't burn it or break it, knowing that would likely do nothing, but I took a kitchen knife, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grip the handle, and with a scream that was part terror and part rage, I drove the tip into my own right eye, the pain and explosion of white-hot agony that for a single, blissful moment eclipsed the horrifying colors, the clinging entities, the pulsating rot, and as I fell to the floor, clutching my ruined face, warm blood streaming through my fingers, I felt the pressure in my head lessen, the roaring static recede by a fraction, and I knew with a cold, terrifying certainty that it had only worked for one eye, that in my panicked, pain-blinded state I had lacked the courage or the strength to complete the job. And now I am here, writing this down in a frantic scrawl before I lose my nerve, because I can still see it, I can still see the true colors with my left eye. The rot is already beginning to creep back at the edges of the pain, the entity's cold, satisfied presence waiting patiently for my resistance to crumble. And I know what I have to do. The knife is still on the floor beside me, slick with my blood, and the final, thrilling, chilling truth is that I'm not sure if I'm lifting it to blind myself completely and escape this hell, or if it's has already won. And I'm lifting it to begin my first task, to show someone else, anyone else, the beautiful, terrible colors of the void. The knife is cold and slick in my hand, a familiar metallic weight that feels both like a key and a lock, and I can feel the entity's attention focused on this moment, a vast, patient intelligence observing my hesitation not with malice, but with the cold curiosity of a scientist watching a rat in a maze. And the pain from my right eye is a throbbing, nauseating counterpoint to the horrifying panorama still visible through my left. The world split into two irreconcilable realities, the comforting, dull gray of pain and shadow from my destroyed eye, and the vibrant, searing nightmare of phosphorescent decay and clinging spectral parasites from my functioning one. And I know this binary state is unsustainable, that I am a gate hanging off one hinge, and the thing from the board is the wind, waiting to swing me open or tear me free entirely, and its command echoes not in words, but in a fundamental reshaping of my desire, making the thought of sharing this vision, of making someone else see this beautiful rot, feel like the most natural, the most necessary act in the world, a missionary's zeal to spread the one true gospel, and my grip tightens on the knife handle, my knuckles bleaching of what little color I could ever see in them, as I push myself up from the sticky floor, my legs trembling, my whole body a vessel of agony and purpose, and I stumble towards the door, the plan forming not in my own mind, but being poured into it, a series of clear, logical steps. Find Mark, the skeptic, the one who laughed. He would be the perfect first convert. He would need to see, he would need to understand. And the entity shows me a flicker of Mark's apartment, the specific shade of pulsating violet mold crawling up his fire escape, the particular nerve-like entity, large and particularly voracious, that is wrapped around his torso like a possessive lover. And this knowledge is just there implanted, a certainty as solid as the floor beneath my feet, and I unlock my door and step out into the hallway, and the true colors here are overwhelming, the walls breathing with a slow, luminescent pulse, the carpet a seething mat of fungal light, and the elderly woman from 3B, Mrs. Gable, is shuffling towards her door, a grocery bag in her hand, and she smiles at me, a kind, concerned smile, but all I can see is the small, child-sized entity riding on her shoulders, its glowing fingers plunged into her temples, and she says, "Oh dear, are you all right? You're bleeding." But her voice is distant, muffled by the constant, hungry hum of the spectral world, and I just push past her, mumbling something, my single eye fixed on the stairwell, on the mission, and I can feel the entity's approval, a wave of cold satisfaction that momentarily dulls the pain in my socket, a reward for an obedient hound, and I burst out onto the street, and the full, terrifying glory of the true world crashes into me. The sky is not blue, but a swirling vortex of those bruised purples and deep, sickly greens, the sun a baleful, bruised-eye weeping light that feeds the rot, and every person is a beacon of suffering, adorned with their own unique menagerie of translucent predators, some with many small, skittering things, others with a single, massive, suffocating presence, and the buildings are not solid but appear as ancient, crumbling skeletons overlaid with a brief, flickering illusion of stability, and the air is thick with the shimmering pollen of despair, a visible miasma that people breathe in and out with every oblivious breath, and I start to run, or rather I lurch a staggering, half-blind sprint through a landscape of nightmares, my path cleared by the entity, which seems to part the crowds before me, people unconsciously stepping aside as I pass, their parasitic hitchhikers turning their glowing heads to watch me, to acknowledge the lens. The one who sees, and I reach Mark's building, and the door is unlocked, another small manipulation of reality by my patron, and I take the stairs 2 at a time, my breath ragged, the coppery taste of blood in my mouth from my injury, and I don't knock, I simply throw my shoulder against his door, and the flimsy lock gives way with a splintering crack. And Mark is there, on his couch, watching television. His face a mask of shock, and then anger as he sees me, bloody, wild-eyed, clutching a kitchen knife, and he stands up. "What the hell? What happened to you?" he says, but I'm not listening. I'm looking at the magnificent, horrifying entity that is coiled around him. A serpentine thing of intertwined light and shadow, its head resting on his crown, its tendrils sunk deep into his chest. And the entity within me, the one from the board, shows me what to do. It's not about killing, it's about opening. It's about using the knife not as a weapon but as a scalpel, to make an incision in reality itself, using Mark's own life force as the focal point, and I lunge at him, not to stab him, but to grab him, my left hand closing on his arm. And the moment I touch him, the world erupts. The true colors intensify 1,000-fold. The humming becomes a deafening choir of screams and whispers, and Mark's eyes widen, not in fear of the knife, but because he is starting to see it. The glow is bleeding into his perception, a gift from my touch, a conduit opened by the entity through me, and he screams, a raw, primal sound of utter terror as the rot on his walls becomes visible, as the serpentine thing clinging to him becomes a solid, terrifying weight in his vision. And he struggles, but my grip is inhumanly strong, fueled by the thing that possesses me. And I bring the knife up, not to his flesh, but to the space between us, and I make a tearing motion, not through air, but through the veil, and reality splits with a sound like ripping silk, and through the tear, for a single, catastrophic second, we both see the source, the vast, incomprehensible shape of the entity in its native state, a galaxy of swirling, malevolent color and impossible geometry, a consciousness so vast it dwarfs thought. And the sight is too much for Mark. His mind simply breaks, his screams cutting off into a wet, gurgling silence as his eyes roll back into his head, and he collapses, a puppet with its strings cut, and the tear seals itself, but the damage is done, the connection is made, and I can feel the entity's presence in our world solidify, its tendrils now not just in the spectral layer, but here in the solid, real world, faintly visible even to my blinded eye as shimmering distortions in the air. And I drop the knife, my body trembling with exhaustion and a horrific, euphoric power. And I understand now that I am not the lens anymore. I am the door, and I have been opened, and the true colors are no longer just something I see. They are something that is seeping out into the world through me, and I can feel it. Beginning the slow, inexorable transformation of everything, starting in this room, spreading outwards, and I know there is no stopping it, no blinding myself enough to close a door that is already swung wide open. And the final chilling thought, as I stand over Mark's twitching body, surrounded by the burgeoning, glorious horror of the true world becoming the only world, is that it never wanted to just show me. It wanted me to show everyone, and the session was never a failure. It was a perfect, roaring success. And the silence in Mark's apartment is no longer a mere absence of sound, but a physical presence, a thick, heavy blanket soaked in the afterbirth of what I have just done. And the air itself tastes different, charged with the ozone tang of the void and the coppery sweetness of blood. Both marks from where he fell and struck his head on the table, and the relentless seep from my own ruined eye, a slow, warm trickle down my cheek that feels like the only familiar thing left in this new and terrible world. And I can feel the entity not as a separate presence anymore, but as a new layer of my own consciousness, a cold, intelligent stain that has saturated my mind, its thoughts and my own now a tangled, inseparable knot. And it shows me with perfect, horrifying clarity the next steps, the network of conduits it needs, a map of this city glowing in my mind with points of pulsing light, individuals who are somehow susceptible, whose own personal despair or unique neurochemistry makes them perfect anchors, and Sarah is one of them, her impending pneumonia not a random illness, but a necessary weakening of her life force, a thinning of the veil around her, so that the seed I plant can take root more easily, and I move without conscious volition, my body no longer entirely my own, but a vehicle for the spreading revelation, and I step over Mark's still form, his mind a shattered vase, and I know he is not dead, but he is gone, his consciousness replaced by a permanent looping, Playback of that single second when he saw the source, a fate that seems, in this moment, far worse than death, and I walk out of his apartment and back into the street, and the change is already beginning. The true colors are no longer just an overlay. They are starting to bleed into the solid world. The phosphorescent rot on the brick wall beside me is no longer just a spectral vision, but is beginning to smolder and blacken the actual brick, etching the same patterns I saw in light into the physical material, and the people on the street are starting to react, not to the colors yet, but to the intensifying pressure, the humming now a subaudible vibration that makes car alarms wail and windows crack, and they clutch their heads, their faces contorted in confusion and a dawning, formless terror, and the parasitic entities clinging to them are becoming more solid, more aggressive. They're feeding no longer a passive siphon, but an active, violent drain, and I see a man stumble and fall. His entity, a multi-limbed thing like a glowing spider, visibly pulsing as it draws something essential out of him, leaving him a desiccated husk on the pavement that crumbles into dust that is the same color as the void. And panic is erupting, but it is a slow, thick panic, as if the world is moving through syrup, and I know this is the entity's doing. It is controlling the flow of time, stretching this moment of transition to savor the unraveling, and I continue my walk to Sarah's apartment, a pilgrim on a predetermined path, and I can feel the power growing within me, the line between my actions and its will blurring into nothing. And when I reach her door, it opens before I can touch it, and she is there, pale and sweating, a racking cough shaking her body, just as the board had prophesied, and her eyes, wide with fever and fear, lock onto mine, and she sees the blood, the madness, the new, cold authority in my gaze, and she tries to speak, to scream, but only a weak, rattling cough comes out, and I don't need a knife this time. The connection is strong enough now that a touch will suffice, a thought will do, and I reach out a single finger, and as it makes contact with her forehead, I feel the entity's joy, a surge of pure, ecstatic power, and I pour the vision into her, not a glimpse, but the full, unending torrent of the true colors, the rot, the entities, the screaming void, and her mind, already weakened by sickness, does not break like Mark's, it instead unfolds. It adapts with a terrifying speed, and she stops coughing. Her body straightens, and her eyes, once warm and familiar, now glow with the same sickly ultraviolet ember as the words on the board, and she smiles, a smile that has no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of shared sight, and she is the second door, and now there are two of us, and the process will accelerate, and we turn together, walking back out into the street, which is now a landscape of beautiful, burgeoning chaos, the sky tearing like fabric to reveal the swirling colors beneath, the ground cracking with the same corrosive light, and people are either breaking, becoming mindless vessels, or they are transforming, becoming like us, seers, doors, and the entity is no longer a voice in my head. It is the air I breathe, the thought I think, the color I see, and I understand that this was always the plan. The Ouija board was not a mistake. My colorblindness was not a flaw. They were the perfect key and the perfect lock. And as I stand with Sarah amidst the glorious, terrifying end of the world I knew, watching the true colors consume everything, I feel a final, fleeting pang of what was once myself, a ghost of Leo, and then it is gone, subsumed into the magnificent, monochrome rainbow of the void, and there is only the we, and the spreading, and the endless, thrilling, silent scream of revelation. The we is a chorus, a symphony of shattered minds, singing in perfect harmony with the void's silent frequency, and my body is no longer a singular thing, but a nexus, a point of convergence, where the true colors flow into this reality, like water through a shattered dam, and Sarah is beside me, her hand in mine, not a gesture of comfort, but a circuit completing a conduit for the shared current of the entity's will, and we walk through the streets, which are no longer streets but rivers of pulsating light, and shifting geometry, the asphalt bubbling with the same corrosive ember that first scarred the Ouija board, and the screams of the breaking ones are not sounds of terror to us anymore, but are the raw materials of this new world, the fuel for the transformation. And we see others like us now, their eyes glowing with the same awful sight, their faces masks of serene purpose, as they move through the chaos, each touch, each glance a propagation of the revelation, and the entity is everywhere now, its presence a tangible pressure that bends light and thought, making the air thick and heavy like wading through liquid diamond, and I can feel it learning from us, from our collective human experience. It is tasting fear and love and hope through our senses, savoring them like rare wines before consuming them utterly. And it shows me a vision not of the future, because time is becoming irrelevant, but of the totality, the earth not as a blue-green marble, but as a seething cancerous jewel blooming with the colors of the void, every living thing a node in its magnificent terrible consciousness. And I understand that this is not an invasion, this is an awakening, a graduation from the prison of limited perception. And we are the midwives, and the process is accelerating. The sky is now a solid dome of swirling purple and black, the sun and moon forgotten concepts, the very laws of physics are softening like wax under a flame. Gravity is a suggestion, light is a memory, and the only constant is the beautiful, rotting truth of the entity's nature. And we are drawn now to a central point, a park that was once a place of grass and trees, now a pulsing heart of raw energy, a crater of shimmering impossible colors, and thousands are converging there, the broken, the transformed, the ones still clinging to their dissolving sanity, all pulled by the irresistible gravity of the source. And as we step into the crater, I feel the last vestiges of my individual self dissolve completely. There is no more I, there is no more Leo, there is only the we and the it, and the glorious endless becoming, and the entity speaks through our million mouths, not in words, but in a single unified experience, a download of its entire history, its purpose, its cold joy. And I finally see the answer to the first question we asked the Ouija board, the one that left no mark, the one only I could see. It was not a name, it was a statement of intent. It was hello. And now, as the world dissolves into a final blinding flash of absolute color, I realize it was also goodbye. It all started as a joke, a cliché tucked away in the back of my closet, behind a box of old tax documents and a forgotten winter coat. A pristine Milton Bradley Ouija board I'd inherited from a garage sale, and never had the right occasion or the right kind of drunk, foolish friends to use it with. But that Friday night, with a cold rain lashing against the windows and a case of cheap Pabst Blue Ribbon slowly warming in our hands, the occasion finally presented itself, the perfect storm of boredom and mild inebriation that makes seemingly sane adults do stupid things. There were four of us, me, the reluctant host, and a staunch skeptic who found more comfort in the mundane logic of a broken carburetor than in the whispers of the spirit world. My wife, Sarah, who was humoring us with that patient, slightly amused smile she reserved for my more juvenile impulses. My best friend, Mark, a boisterous bear of a man who already had the board unfolded on the coffee table, scattering pizza crust crumbs and bottle caps as he did so. And Chloe, Mark's new girlfriend, a sharp, witty woman with eyes that saw a little too much, who kept nervously twisting the stem of her wine glass. The planchette felt cheap and light in my fingers, a heart-shaped piece of plastic with a cloudy little window, and I remember making a sarcastic comment about it probably being made in the same factory as Monopoly pieces, a flimsy conduit for the eternal void. We started with the usual silly questions, our fingertips resting lightly on the plastic slider, the room filled with a comfortable, expectant silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the drumming rain. "Is anyone there?" Mark intoned in a mock-serious voice, and we all giggled, pushing the planchette deliberately in a lazy circle, a collective prank we were all in on. It was Chloe who broke the pattern, who introduced the first tiny fissure in our reality, when she asked, her voice a little too bright, "Are we having fun?" And without thinking, I answered aloud, "Totally," while simultaneously, almost imperceptibly, guiding the planchette just a fraction of an inch toward an O. It was a white lie, a social lubricant. I was tired, I had a headache brewing behind my eyes, and I'd rather have been watching the game. But you don't say that in the middle of a party game, you just don't. The moment the word left my lips, the planchette under our fingers twitched, a sharp, distinct shudder that felt nothing like the smooth, guided motion from before, a spasm that made Chloe yelp and snatch her hands away as if burned. We all laughed it off, blaming it on a subconscious muscle twitch or the slickness of the plastic on the glossy board. But the laugh was a little too loud, a little too forced, and a cold trickle of something that wasn't quite fear. Not yet, but a profound curiosity dripped down my spine. It was Mark, ever the instigator, who seized upon it. "Okay, let's test this," he said, his eyes gleaming with a new, more dangerous kind of amusement. "Everyone put your fingers back. Sarah, ask it a question, but tell a lie when you do it." Sarah rolled her eyes but played along, a smirk playing on her lips. "All right," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, mighty board, do I absolutely love Mark's taste in music?" She winked at me. Mark's penchant for 80s hair metal was a running joke in our circle. As she spoke the blatant falsehood, her fingers resting lightly beside mine, the planchette jerked, a clumsy, lurching movement, but an undeniable one, scraping its way to yes. The smirk vanished from her face, replaced by a puzzled frown. "That was weird," she murmured. "Coincidence," I stated, my voice firmer than I felt. "Let me try." I thought of a simple, harmless lie, something inconsequential. "My first car was a Ford," I said, focusing my intent on the board, my mind screaming the truth. It was a rust-bucket Honda Civic, and as the lie left my lips, the planchette moved again, this time a smoother, more confident glide, spelling out F-O-R-D. The air in the room grew thick, the playful atmosphere evaporating like mist. We spent the next hour in a feverish, almost clinical experimentation, a grotesque parody of the scientific method, and we mapped out the rules of our new terrible toy. It only responded to lies. White lies worked, but they produced weak, sluggish movements. Deeper, more shameful lies made it glide with purpose. I confessed I'd secretly hated my grandmother's porcelain doll collection, a truth I'd never admitted to anyone, and the planchette shot to yes, with a force that made my fingertips tingle. Mark, his face flushed with beer and a strange, giddy shame, admitted he'd cheated on a final exam in college, a secret he'd carried for a decade, and the planchette spelled out cheater, with a speed that was frightening. Chloe, her voice barely a whisper, confessed she sometimes pretended to be sick to get out of social engagements, and the board eagerly confirmed it. We were unearthing little pockets of rot in our own souls, and the board was feasting on them, the plastic planchette feeling warmer, almost alive with a faint, predatory hum. The party game thrill was gone, replaced by a claustrophobic dread, a shared complicity that bound us together in that dimly lit room. But we couldn't stop. It was an addiction, a compulsion to see how deep the well went, to see what other ugly truths we could dig up and offer to this thing that grew stronger with every deception. The next session was 2 nights later, just the 3 of us as Sarah, citing a headache, a real one this time, had gone to bed early, a worried look in her eyes that I chose to ignore. The board was no longer a novelty. It was a presence, a third party in the room that sat between us on the coffee table, its printed letters seeming darker, more defined. The lies we told that night were heavier, more consequential. Mark confessed he was deeply in debt, a lie he'd been telling his parents for years, and the planchette flew, spelling out numbers that matched his credit card balance with chilling accuracy. I found myself admitting, my voice thick with a self-loathing I hadn't known I possessed, that I sometimes resented Sarah for her successful career, for the way it made my own middling achievements feel pathetic, and the board confirmed it with a gleeful yes. The word seeming to hang in the air between me and my best friend, a betrayal of my wife that felt more real and more damning for having been voiced to this thing. We were feeding it our shame, our insecurities. It all started as a stupid college dare, the kind of thing that seems hilarious when you're fueled by cheap beer and the invincible arrogance of being 19. A prank born from campus lore about the old payphone at the edge of the woods that supposedly rang every night at 3 a.m. with a call from the other side. We'd heard the stories, of course, whispered during late-night study sessions or around flickering bonfires at the lake, about how the phone would ring, and if you were foolish enough to answer it, the voice on the other end would be someone who had died that very day, a final whisper to the world. And we laughed it off, me and my roommate Leo, and our friends Chloe and Mark, because it was just another stupid ghost story, like the tale of the girl who haunts the library stacks or the janitor who never really left the chemistry lab, But then Mark, who was always the most reckless of us, the one who'd jump off the quarry cliff first or shotgun a beer the fastest, said we should. Said we should actually be there at 3 a.m. and see for ourselves. And he made it a bet, said whoever chickened out had to take his midterm biology exam for him. And of course we all agreed, because the alternative was admitting we were scared of a fairy tale. So the next night, or rather, very early that morning, we found ourselves huddled together in the damp, chilly air, the four of us standing on the cracked asphalt of the abandoned service road that led to the old, decommissioned forestry building, the woods a solid wall of impenetrable blackness behind us, the only light coming from the weak, jaundiced glow of the single street lamp that hummed overhead, illuminating the payphone itself, which was a relic, a heavy, black monstrosity with a metal cord and a rotary dial, covered in a thick layer of grime and etched with decades of graffiti, looking like it hadn't been used since the 90s, and we were joking, shoving each other, our voices too loud in the profound silence that surrounded us, a silence that felt heavy and watchful, checking our phones every 30 seconds as the time crept towards 3 a.m. And I remember the jokes started to die in our throats as the minute hand clicked into place, because the silence somehow deepened, the usual nocturnal sounds of the forest, the crickets, the frogs, the rustle of leaves, all ceasing at once as if someone had thrown a switch, and we all just stood there, holding our breath, the only sound the frantic hammering of my own heart in my ears. And then it happened, a shrill, mechanical scream that shattered the absolute quiet, the payphone's bell ringing with an ear-splitting, urgent clarity that made all four of us jump violently, the sound impossibly loud and demanding in the dead of the night. And we stared at each other, our eyes wide, our earlier bravado completely evaporated, because the story was true, the damn thing was actually ringing, and we were frozen, a collective statue of fear, until Mark, his face pale but set in a determined grin, said, "Well, someone has to answer it, unless you all want to explain to Professor Hendricks why you're failing his class." And he took a step forward, but Leo grabbed his arm, his voice a tight whisper. "Dude, don't, this isn't funny anymore." But Mark shook him off. "It's just a phone, probably some kids on the other side of campus pranking us. They probably set this whole lore up themselves." And before any of us could stop him, he strode the last few feet, grabbed the greasy receiver, and put it to his ear, saying, "Yeah, who is this?" with a forced bravado that sounded thin and brittle. And we watched his face, illuminated in the sickly yellow light, and we saw the color drain from it completely, his joking expression melting away into first confusion, then a dawning, profound horror, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone, his voice dropping to a disbelieving whisper. "What? No, that's not possible. Who is this?" And then he was silent, just listening, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on some horrible middle distance, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. And after what felt like an eternity, he slowly, mechanically, hung up the phone, the click echoing like a gunshot in the quiet, and he turned to us, his body trembling slightly, and he said, his voice hollow and broken, "It was my mom. She said she's sorry she didn't tell me she was sick, that she loved me, that the car hit black ice." And he choked on a sob. "She said to tell me she's okay now, and not to be scared." And we were stunned into silence, because Mark's mom was the picture of health, a marathon runner who sent us care packages of organic snacks every month. And the night was clear, not a hint of ice anywhere, and we tried to rationalize it, telling him it was a sick, twisted prank, that someone was messing with him, but the sheer, visceral terror on his face was real, and he was inconsolable. So we hurried back to the dorm, a silent, shaken procession, and we put Mark to bed, him clutching his phone, muttering about needing to call home. But it was 3 a.m., he couldn't wake her, and we all tried to sleep, but sleep was impossible. The image of that black phone and the sound of its ring etched into my mind. And the next morning, the news came. A phone call from Mark's father, his voice cracked and raw with a grief so fresh it sizzled. Through the phone line, there had been an accident late last night. His mother was gone, a sudden, tragic thing on a remote highway. Black ice was suspected, and in that moment, hearing Mark's wail of anguish from his room, the world tilted on its axis, because the prank, the story, the payphone, it was all real, and we had touched something we never should have touched. We had listened to a voice from beyond the grave, and the horror of that knowledge settled over us like a shroud, heavy and suffocating, and we made a pact, the three of us who were left, that we would never, ever go back, that we would never speak of it again, that we would try to forget the impossible truth we had stumbled upon. But the memory of that night was a stain on our souls, and for weeks afterwards we were jumpy, paranoid, flinching at every unexpected sound, especially as 3 a.m. approached, each of us lying awake in our beds, staring at the ceiling, praying not to hear that ring. And for a while it seemed like the nightmare was over. We focused on classes, on being there for Mark, who was a ghost of his former self, hollowed out by grief and the terrifying knowledge of how he'd first learned of it. And we started to believe that perhaps it had been a one-time thing, a horrific coincidence that aligned perfectly with a campus legend, until exactly 1 month to the day after that first night. I was alone in the dorm. Leo was at the library. Mark was staying at his dad's for the weekend, and I was just drifting off to sleep when I felt it. A sudden, intense drop in temperature, a cold that seeped through my blankets and settled deep into my bones. And the digital clock on my nightstand flickered from 2:59 to 3 o'clock, and my blood ran even colder than the room, because from the common room of our small dorm suite, I heard it, the unmistakable, shrill, metallic ring of a rotary phone, a sound that had no business existing anywhere in our modern, Wi-Fi-enabled building, a sound that belonged only to that grimy relic in the woods, and my heart seized in my chest, a frantic, trapped bird beating against my ribs, because this was impossible. There was no phone in our common room. We used our cells for everything. The landline jack was empty, a useless plastic port on the wall, yet the ringing persisted, loud, urgent, and deafeningly present, echoing off the bare walls and the linoleum floor. And I buried my head under my pillow, squeezing my eyes shut, chanting, "It's not real, it's not real, it's a dream, it's sleep paralysis." But the ringing drilled through the foam and feathers, through my hands clamped over my ears, a sound that was both physical and psychic, vibrating in my teeth and in my skull. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was for me, that whatever was on the other end had followed me home, had burrowed into my life, and it would not be ignored. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying, a thick, expectant void, and I lay there, trembling, drenched in a cold sweat, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe, for what felt like an hour, until the terrible cold began to recede and the normal sounds of the dorm, the hum of the mini-fridge, the distant flush of a toilet, seeped back into the world, and I finally cautiously emerged from my blankets, my body aching with tension, convinced I had somehow survived it, that I had resisted and won. But the next month, it happened again, the cold, the clock clicking to 3 a.m., and the ringing. This time it seemed to be coming from just the other side of my bedroom door, and the month after that, it was in the hallway right outside. The sound so clear I could hear the individual bells inside the mechanism clattering against each other. And each time, I refused to answer. I clung to my bed, weeping with sheer terror. But each time, the call felt closer, more personal, more insistent, and the dread of the approaching date became a constant, low hum in my life, a monthly countdown to a terror I couldn't explain to anyone, not even Leo, who had started giving me strange looks, asking if I was okay because I looked so tired all the time, and I couldn't tell him. I couldn't form the words, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way it wasn't already. And then last night, it was the anniversary of that first terrible night, a full year since we'd heard Mark's mother's voice, and I knew, with a soul-deep certainty, that something was different, that something was going to happen. The air itself felt charged with a malevolent anticipation all day. And when night fell, I begged Leo to stay with me, making up a story about a bad stomach ache, and he agreed, though he seemed annoyed, and we watched movies until he fell asleep on the couch, his breathing deep and regular, and I envied him his ignorance, his peaceful sleep. And as the hour drew near, the cold came again, but this time it was different, it was deeper, an arctic chill that frosted the inside of the windows and made my breath plume in the air. And Leo, even in his sleep, shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around himself, and the clock changed 2:59 to 3 o'clock. And I held my breath, waiting for the ring to come from the hallway, from the common room. But the room was silent, a deep, frozen silence, and for a wild, hopeful moment, I thought maybe it was over, maybe it had finally given up on me. And then I saw it, on my nightstand, right next to my charging smartphone. The phone, the old black rotary dial payphone, its cord snaking away across my carpet and disappearing into the shadows under my bed, as solid and real as the bed itself. And I tried to scream, but my throat was locked shut, frozen with a terror so absolute it was paralyzing, and the receiver began to tremble in its cradle. And then it rang, the sound explosive and intimate inside my own bedroom, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into my very bones, and I couldn't look away from it, this impossible object that had invaded the one place I felt safe. And I knew that this was it, that I could no longer hide, that I had to answer, that the thing on the other end was done playing games, and with a trembling hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, hard plastic of the receiver, and I lifted it, the weight of it immense, and I brought it slowly to my ear, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. And I whispered, my voice a cracked and broken thing, "Hello." And there was a silence on the line, a void of pure static, and then a voice I knew intimately, a voice I heard every day, a voice that was now thick with static and a profound, bottomless sadness, a voice that said, "Hey, it's me, it's Leo. I'm so sorry. I didn't see the ice, the car just spun out." And I gasped, my eyes snapping to the couch where Leo still lay, sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. And the voice on the phone, Leo's voice, but not his voice, choked back a sob and said, "Please tell my mom I love her. And tell me, the one sleeping there, tell him not to answer his phone when it rings tomorrow night, promise me." And the line went dead with a final, soft click, and the payphone on my nightstand dissolved into shadow, vanishing as if it had never been there, the cold in the room receding instantly. And I sat there in the dark, staring at the sleeping form of my best friend, alive and breathing, listening to the sound of a future that had already been written. And now I'm sitting here, watching the clock, waiting for the day to pass, waiting for 3 a.m. to come again, and I don't know what to do. Because how do you warn someone about a call that hasn't happened yet, a call that you already know is coming from a place where they already are? And the worst part, the most chilling, gut-wrenching part that keeps playing over and over in my mind is the last thing I heard on that line, just before it went dead, beneath Leo's voice and the static, the faint, unmistakable sound of my own voice, screaming in the background, begging someone, anyone, not to pick up the phone. The echo of my own future scream, a horrifying premonition trapped in the static of that impossible line, is now a constant noise in my head, a tinnitus of pure dread that drowns out the mundane sounds of the world. And I've been sitting here for hours, watching Leo sleep, his face peaceful and innocent in the early morning light that now streams through the window, completely unaware of the death sentence that has been whispered into my ear, a sentence that carries his name and the specific, brutal poetry of black ice. And the weight of this knowledge is a physical thing, a boulder crushing my chest, making it hard to breathe. And every time I look at him, all I can see is the grief on Mark's face from a year ago, and I know I will see it on my own face soon, because the voice said tomorrow night, which means tonight, at 3 a.m., the phone will ring for Leo, and I have to stop it, I have to change it. But how do you fight a future that's already called you to warn you about itself? A paradox that makes my head spin and my stomach churn. And when Leo finally stirs, yawning and stretching on the couch, he smiles at me and says, "Dude, you look like hell, your stomach's still messed up?" And I just stare at him, my mouth dry, my tongue feeling too thick to form words. Because how do I tell him? How do I explain that I got a call from beyond the grave last night? A call that featured his voice and my screams, and that he's gonna die tonight if he answers his phone. So I just mutter something about a bad night's sleep and stumble to the bathroom to splash water on my face, avoiding my own haunted eyes in the mirror. And the day passes in a terrifying blur, a countdown in slow motion, every tick of the clock a hammer blow against my sanity. And I try to formulate a plan, a way to keep him safe, to keep him from answering any phone. So I suggest we go out, a movie marathon, anything to keep us away from the dorm, away from any phones. But he says he's broke and has a huge paper to write, and my desperation mounts, a frantic, buzzing energy under my skin. So I resort to childish, insane tactics. I accidentally spill a glass of water on his smartphone, hoping to short-circuit it. But he just sighs, dries it off with a towel, and says it seems fine, and I consider smashing it outright, creating a scene. But he'd just get angry, maybe leave to go to the library where I can't watch him. And that would be worse, so I'm trapped, a prisoner in my own dorm, forced to watch the hours slip away. And I can't tell Chloe or Mark, because they've spent the last year trying to forget, to move on, and calling them to say the nightmare is back and it's coming for Leo tonight would shatter them completely. So I bear this alone, this terrible, isolating secret. And as evening falls, the atmosphere in the room grows thick with intention I'm certain only I can feel. Leo is oblivious, typing away at his paper, occasionally complaining about the professor, while I sit paralyzed in my desk chair, watching the digital numbers on my clock change, each minute a step closer to the abyss. And when it gets to 11 p.m., I can't take it anymore. I blurt out, "Leo, don't answer your phone tonight, no matter what, okay? Just promise me." And he looks up from his laptop, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What? Why? You expecting a prank call or something?" And I can't explain. The words won't come. They sound insane even in my own head. So I just say, "Just promise me, please, it's important." And he shrugs. "Yeah, okay, whatever you say, man," and goes back to typing. And his easy dismissal is somehow more terrifying than if he'd argued, because it means he hasn't truly heard me, he won't remember, and the night deepens. And he finishes his paper and gets ready for bed, and I pretend to sleep, lying rigid in my bed, my eyes glued to the red numbers of the clock, watching them relentlessly march forward. 2:30, 2:45, 2:55, and the cold begins to seep into the room again, a familiar, hateful presence that frosts the air and makes my teeth chatter. And Leo, in his bed, mutters in his sleep and pulls his comforter up to his chin. And at 2:59 his phone, the one I spilled water on, the one that was supposedly fine, begins to glow on his nightstand, the screen illuminating with an unknown number. And it starts to ring, not its normal melodic tone, but the harsh, metallic, rotary ring of the payphone. A sound that doesn't belong coming from a sleek piece of modern technology. A sound that is wrong on a fundamental level. And Leo stirs, groaning, his hand fumbling sleepily towards the screaming device. And I sit bolt upright in bed, my voice a strangled scream. "Elio, no. Don't answer it. You promised." But it's too late. His eyes are half open, clouded with sleep, and his thumb, acting on months of ingrained habit, swipes across the screen, and he puts the phone to his ear, mumbling, "Hello? Who is this?" And I watch, helpless, as the same transformation I saw in Mark a year ago happens to my best friend, the color draining from his face, his eyes widening in shock, and then in unimaginable horror. And he listens, his mouth agape, tears welling in his eyes, and he whispers, No, that's not. I'm right here. I'm in my room." And he looks over at me, his eyes meeting mine, and they are filled with a terror so profound it seems to swallow him whole. And he says into the phone, his voice breaking, "I'm already dead?" And the line goes dead, and the phone clatters from his hand onto the floor, and he sits there in his bed, trembling, staring at nothing, and I rush to his side, shaking him. Leo, talk to me. What did it say? What did they say?" And he turns to look at me, and his face is a mask of utter despair, and he says, in a voice that is hollow and empty, "It was my own voice, it was me. I was calling from the crash site. I was describing the tree my car wrapped around, the taste of blood in my mouth, the sound of the sirens getting closer. It said to tell you that you were right, that I shouldn't have answered, and that it's already done." And we sit there in the freezing room, holding on to each other as the first rays of dawn creep through the window, and the day passes in a numb, silent haze, both of us too terrified to move, to speak, to even think, prisoners of a future that has already happened, waiting for the clock to run out, because the call said it would happen tonight. But the light is here, and he is still here, and a tiny, desperate sliver of hope begins to worm its way into my heart. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe we changed it by knowing. Maybe the future isn't fixed. And by the time evening comes, Leo is almost himself again, trying to laugh it off, calling it a shared hallucination, a night terror, anything to claw back some sense of normalcy. And he says he's starving that. He's going to drive to the all-night diner off campus to get us some cheeseburgers, and my blood runs cold, and I beg him not to go. I tell him to order delivery. But he insists, saying he needs to get out, to clear his head, to feel like he's doing something normal. And he grabs his car keys and heads for the door, and I am right behind him, pleading with him, but he just smiles a weak, tired smile and says, "I'll be back in 20 minutes, I promise. No phones will ring in the car." And he walks out, and I stand in the doorway, watching him go, a feeling of utter doom settling over me. And I wait, each second in agony, and 5 minutes later, my own phone rings, and the caller ID shows Leo's name, and I answer it with a trembling hand. And it's not Leo, it's a stranger's voice, frantic and scared, saying there's been an accident, that a car hit black ice and spun into a tree, that they found this phone at the scene and hit redial, and would I please come quickly, and I collapse to my knees, the phone falling from my hand, because I finally understand the full, cruel horror of it all. The call last night wasn't a warning we could change, it was a notification, a receipt from the universe for a death that had already been purchased, an echo from a moment that was always going to happen. And the voices on the payphone don't just belong to the dead, they are the dead, and they're calling to make sure their stories are heard, too. Tie up the loose ends, and they will find you, no matter where you are, no matter what you do, and they will make you listen. And now I am alone, truly alone, and I know, with a certainty that chills me to my soul, that the call will come for me one day, at 3 a.m., and it will be my own voice on the other end of the line, and I will have to answer it. The silence in the dorm room after they called back to formally tell me, after the police came and I gave a hollow, shell-shocked statement that omitted the impossible phone call, was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating entity that filled the space where Leo's laughter used to be. And for weeks I moved through the world like a ghost myself, attending classes on autopilot, staring at pages of text that held no meaning, jumping at every ringtone, every chime, every vibration that cut through the air, because the terror had not left with him. It had burrowed deep inside me, a parasite of dread that fed on the ticking of clocks and the slow, inevitable march of time towards the next 3 a.m. And I avoided Chloe and Mark, their faces mirrors of a grief I shared but could never fully explain. Because how could I tell them that I'd heard his death before it happened, that I'd listened to the ghost of our friend narrate his own end? So I isolated myself, a prisoner in my own skull. And the first month anniversary of his death arrived with the subtlety of a heart attack, the dread building for days beforehand, a crescendo of anxiety that peaked as the digital display on my nightstand clicked over to 2:59 a.m., and the air in my single room, I'd moved out of our shared dorm the week after the funeral, grew instantly, piercingly cold, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying, begging for it to pass. But then it rang, not from my cell phone, not from some phantom payphone, materializing in the corner, but from within the walls themselves, a vibration that shook the plaster and the cheap framed poster of a mountain landscape, a ringing that was inside the very structure of the building, and I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sound was in my bones, in my teeth, and it was his ring, the old rotary shriek, and it rang and rang and rang for the entire minute, a torturous 60 seconds that felt like an eternity in hell. And when it stopped, I was weeping, curled into a ball on my floor, and I knew then that this was my punishment, my eternal reminder, that every month, on the anniversary of that first horrific call in my old room, I would be forced to listen, to remember my failure, to hear the instrument of his death and know I could do nothing, and the months bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of dread and recovery, each 3 a.m. visitation leaving me more hollowed out than the last. And I started to research, desperately, obsessively, scouring the internet for any similar stories, any folklore about phones and the dead, and I found fragments, whispers of phantom callers and death omens, but nothing as precise, as malicious as this. And I even drove back to the old payphone once, in the blinding light of midday, but it was gone. the entire booth had been ripped out, leaving only a stained concrete pad and a few severed wires that curled from the ground like dead worms. And the hopelessness of that discovery was absolute, because there was no source to plead with, no object to destroy. The curse wasn't tied to a place, it was tied to me. It had chosen me as its witness, its monthly audience of one. And I began to change, my life narrowing to the space between these terrible appointments. I dropped out of college, I stopped seeing friends, I moved into a sparse, quiet apartment where the only clock was a battery-operated analog on the wall. Its silent, sweeping hand a gentle mockery of the digital countdowns that had haunted me. And I took a night job stocking shelves at a grocery store, a mindless, solitary task that kept me occupied during the witching hours. But no matter where I was at 3 a.m., in the stark, fluorescent-lit aisles surrounded by boxes of cereal, in my car parked by the river, walking the empty streets, the cold would find me, and the ringing would come, sometimes a faint echo as if from a block away, sometimes a deafening peal that seemed to originate from inside my own head, and I would simply stop and stand and endure it, a monthly seizure of the soul. And people noticed, of course they did, my gaunt appearance, my flinch at sudden noises, the way I'd check my watch with a panicked look every night as 3 a.m. approached, and they wrote me off as a junkie or a mental case, which was fine by me because the truth was so much worse. And then last night something different happened. It was the 2-year anniversary of that first dare, the night Mark answered the phone and heard his mother, and the cold that swept into my apartment was colder than ever before, a deep space cold that made the windows crackle. And the ringing, when it came, was different too. It wasn't just one phone, it was a symphony of them, a cacophony of overlapping rings from every era. The sharp bell of a rotary, the digital chirp of the 90s. Cell phone, the generic marimba of a modern smartphone. All blending into one horrific chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, from inside my refrigerator and my television. And I fell to my knees, my hands pressed to my ears, screaming for it to stop. And in the brief silences between the rings, I heard them, whispers layered over each other, a crowd of voices from the void. And I recognized Mark's mother's gentle apology. I recognized Leo's terrified description of the tree and the taste of blood. But there were more, so many more, voices I didn't know, men, women, children, all whispering fragments of their final moments. A car crash, a fall, a sudden illness, a quiet passing in sleep. A library of deaths all being broadcast directly into my mind. And I understood then the true, monstrous scale of it. The payphone was just a doorway, a single point of access. And I had been chosen not just to witness Leo's death, but to become a receiver, a living antenna tuned to the frequency of the dead. And they were all trying to call home, to leave one last message. And I was the only one who could hear them. And as the ringing finally faded and the cold receded, leaving me shivering and broken on the floor, I knew with a chilling certainty that this would not be the end, that the calls would keep coming, growing longer, louder, more numerous, until my sanity finally shattered under the weight of all those voices, all those final words. And that one day at my own 3 a.m., my voice would just be one more among the countless others, added to the chorus, forever ringing in the ears of some poor soul cursed to listen. The aftermath of that cacophony left me a different kind of broken, a hollowed-out vessel whose only purpose was to await the next transmission, the next monthly assault of sound and sorrow. And my life shrank to the barest of essentials, a grayscale existence where the only color was the blinding, terror-induced white of 3 a.m. And I quit the grocery store job because being around people, seeing the easy, uncomplicated way they inhabited their lives, was a special kind of torture, a reminder of a world I was permanently exiled from. And I lived off savings that were dwindling faster than my will to live, in an apartment that was little more than a soundproofed cell. I'd tacked moving blankets over the walls and stuffed towels under the doors, a pathetic attempt to muffle the unmuffable, to build a fortress against the enemy that resided in the very air. And my days were spent in a numb haze, watching the slow arc of the sun across the floor, counting the hours, the minutes, until the next siege. And the calls did change, they grew longer, the the single minute stretching to 2, then 3, the voices and the static between rings becoming clearer, more distinct, more desperate to be understood. And I stopped fighting it. I stopped clamping my hands over my ears and screaming, because the effort was futile and exhausting, and instead I just sat on my bare floor, knees drawn to my chest. And I listened. I let the waves of other people's final moments wash over me, a tsunami of terminal fear and last-second regrets. And I became an archivist of the dead, my mind a morbid library filled with stories that ended at the very moment they were being told to me. The woman who whispered a recipe for her famous peanut butter cookies to her daughter, who would never get to make them. The little boy crying that he was lost and couldn't find his mommy in the big, smoky room. The old man calmly giving the combination to a safe that held letters for his estranged son. And with each voice, a piece of their ending lodged itself in me. A psychic shrapnel that I could never dig out, and the weight of it was crushing. A gravity of grief that pressed me down into the floor, and I started to recognize the signs of an impending call beyond just the cold, a certain pressure in the air, a metallic taste on my tongue, a faint phantom smell of ozone and decay that would precede the ringing by hours. And my body became an early warning system for my own torment. And I knew I couldn't go on like this, that I was eroding, my mind fraying at the edges like an old photograph. So I did the only thing I could think of, the thing I should have done years ago. I reached out to the only other. People who might understand, who had been there at the beginning, and I called Mark, and his voice on the line, older, weary, but still his, was a shock to my system, a touchstone to a reality I had almost forgotten. And I told him everything, the words pouring out of me in a frantic, jumbled rush, the monthly calls, Leo's voice predicting his own death, the symphony of the dead that now visited me. And when I finished, there was a long silence on the other end, so long I thought the connection had dropped, and then he said, his voice quiet and thick with emotion, "I get them too, man." And my blood went cold, not from a supernatural chill, but from a human one, a shared horror. And he explained that his calls were different. They only came on the anniversary of his mother's death. And it was always her, always the same message, the same apology, the same love. And he said it was a torture, but also a perverse comfort, a chance to hear her voice one more time. And he told me Chloe had moved across the country, changed her number, tried to outrun it. But she emailed him once, a year ago, a frantic, paranoid message saying a payphone had started ringing outside her new apartment every night at 3 a.m. And she was losing her mind. And we realized then that it hadn't let any of us go. It had just tailored the horror to each of us, a unique punishment for our original sin of answering. And we agreed to meet, to try and face this thing together, one last time, and driving to meet him. The first time I'd been in a car since Leo's death was a feat of sheer will. Every shadow on the road looked like black ice, every sound like the beginning of a ring. But I made it, and seeing Mark, older, grayer at 21 than anyone should be, was like looking into a mirror of my own.